Okay. Good morning. Welcome to the December 2018 open meeting of the Federal Communications Commission. This is the first commission meeting since the death of our 41st president, George H.W. Bush. So before we turn to our agenda, I'd like to take just a minute to recognize his passing. President Bush left his mark on communications policy just as he had an impact on so many other fields. Perhaps most notably, President Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law on July 26th of 1990. Among other things, the ADA created the first nationwide telecommunications relay service, which, among other things, enables people who have hearing or speech disabilities to have functionally equivalent access to the telephone network. The ADA also required direct access to 911 emergency centers by people with disabilities who previously were reliant on text communications, at the time using TTYs. Indeed, so much of the work that we do at the Commission today to make communications more accessible to all Americans with disabilities has its roots in the ADA. It's also worth noting that the FCC, under the Bush administration, began the transition away from rate of return regulation of phone carriers and towards incentive-based regulation, which is a shift that has had many positive impacts. Indeed, the FCC in this administration has continued that transition, and it is fair to say that the rural broadband order that we'll be voting on later today has been influenced by work that was done during the Bush administration. But beyond the area of policy, President Bush left us a legacy of his example. He saw public service as a calling from his time as a World War II Navy pilot until his presidency, and he brought that perspective to his work. Throughout his lifetime, he served our nation with civility and with decency, and he showed us how it is possible to disagree without being disagreeable. He took his work seriously, but not himself. And so it is not surprising that Americans, especially over the last week or so, have retained such affection for this great patriot and have sought inspiration in his example. And in recognition of his life and service to the country, I would ask you to join me in a brief moment of silence for President George H.W. Bush. Thank you. Astute observers will note a change at the Secretary's desk. Standing in for the indefatigable Marlene Dortch for the first time in, I believe, over half a decade is the FCC's Associate Secretary, Ms. Sigmund. Madam Associate Secretary, could you please introduce our agenda this morning?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you, and good morning, Commissioners. For today's meeting, you will hear 6 items for your consideration. First, you will consider a report and order that would adopt service rule changes for the upper 37 gigahertz, 39 gigahertz, and 47 gigahertz bands, and would provide for an incentive auction mechanism that would offer contiguous blocks of spectrum in the upper 37 gigahertz and 39 gigahertz bands, and additional spectrum in the 47 gigahertz band. Second, you will consider a report and order, further notice of proposed rulemaking, and order on reconsideration. Among other things, the report and order would offer additional funding to carriers that currently receive model-based universal service support in exchange for deploying broadband at increased speeds, provide an opportunity for legacy carriers to transition to model-based support, and authorize additional support for carriers remaining on the legacy rate of return support mechanism in exchange for targeting higher broadband speeds. Third, you will consider a second report and order that would create a comprehensive database to enable callers to verify whether a telephone number has been permanently disconnected and is therefore eligible for reassignment before calling that number, thereby helping to protect consumers with reassigned numbers from receiving unwanted calls. Fourth, you will consider a declaratory ruling that would classify 2 forms of wireless messaging, short message service and multimedia messaging service, as information services under the Communications Act, and help prevent consumers from receiving spam robotexts. Fifth, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that would initiate the 2018 quadrennial review of certain broadcast ownership rules. Sixth, you will consider a report that, pursuant to Ray-Baum's Act, would consolidate several previously separate commission reports into a single report on the state of the broader communications market in the United States. It would assess the state of all forms of competition in the communications marketplace and the state of deployment of communications capabilities, describe the actions taken by the Commission in the previous 2 years to address the challenges and opportunities of the communications marketplace, and discuss the Commission's agenda for continuing to address those challenges and opportunities over the next 2 years. This is your agenda for today. Please note that item 6, entitled Amendment of Parts 0, 1, 5, 73, and 74 of the Commission's rules regarding posting of station licenses and related information, modernization of media regulation initiative, and as listed in the Sunshine Notice on December 3rd, 2018, has been adopted and released by the Commission and deleted from today's agenda. The first item on your agenda will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and Donald Stockdale, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Associate Secretary. Like a boss. Very nice. Mr. Stockdale, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Commissioners. I am pleased to present to you the Spectrum Frontiers fourth report in order. I am joined at the table today by Joel Taubenblatt, Eric Salvara, and Margie Wiener. In addition to the staff at the table, I would like to thank Evan Correll and Paul LaFontaine from the Office of Economics and Analytics for their close collaboration on this item, and everyone listed on the slide for their input and hard work. Eric will now present the item.
Thank you, Don. And good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
Today's fourth report in order will promote the availability of millimeter wave spectrum for 5G wireless, Internet of Things, and other advanced services by enabling the Commission to conduct a single auction offering generic spectrum blocks for much of the combined upper 37 gigahertz and 39 gigahertz bands, as well as for the 47 gigahertz band. The draft report and order makes this possible by facilitating the reconfiguration of existing 39 gigahertz spectrum holdings, currently licensed in small spectrum block sizes and mismatched geographic areas, into more contiguous swaths of spectrum that are conducive to wireless broadband deployment, including 5G services. Reconfiguring incumbent holdings would make existing spectrum usage rights more useful for advanced services while making available contiguous spectrum for new, flexible use licenses. To accomplish these goals, the report and order would take several key steps. First, it would modify the 39 gigahertz block size to 100 megahertz to simplify the transition from existing license holdings to reconfigured holdings. It also would modify the upper 37 gigahertz and 47 gigahertz band plans from 200 megahertz to 100 megahertz channels to facilitate a simultaneous auction of licenses for all three bands. Next, the report and order would adopt an incentive auction that can clear existing 39 gigahertz licenses and create contiguous blocks of spectrum throughout the 39 gigahertz and upper 37 gigahertz bands, thereby maximizing options for incumbents and new entrants. The incentive auction will offer a share of auction proceeds to each incumbent 39 gigahertz licensee that volunteers to relinquish its existing spectrum usage rights. The share offered to each incumbent as an incentive payment will be based on prices for new licenses in the auction. Thus, the auction of new licenses would serve both as the forward and reverse components of the incentive auction. More importantly, the incentive payment offered will provide each incumbent with the opportunity to replace existing spectrum usage rights that are equivalent to a full 100 megahertz spectrum block in the same area without any additional payment. The incentive auction will offer new licenses for contiguous blocks using the spectrum that is relinquished by incumbents and that is not currently licensed. The auction of new licenses would begin with a clock phase, offering quantities of generic spectrum blocks at a uniform price in each partial economic area. New entrants and incumbents that relinquish all existing rights may bid in the clock phase. An incumbent relinquishing all its existing rights for incentive payments will have an opportunity, before bidding begins, and subject to certain restrictions, to exchange some rights between areas to better align the incentive payments that it will receive with prospective new licenses. The clock phase of the auction would be followed by an assignment phase to award frequency-specific licenses. The assignment phase will assign contiguous licenses in each PEA to each party that receives licenses, whether or not the licensees bid in the assignment phase. In addition, parties that participate in the clock phase would have an opportunity to place bids for specific license frequencies in a given PEA in the assignment phase. After the auction, incumbents that have relinquished spectrum usage rights to make spectrum available for new licenses would receive incentive payments. An incumbent's incentive payments could be applied toward any winning bids that it holds for any new licenses in the auction, or could be received in cash. For an incumbent that chooses not to relinquish all its existing rights, the report and order provides methods to modify the incumbent's licenses so that they better align with the new band plan and service areas. To simplify the incumbent's transition, the Commission will propose license modifications that would serve these public interests. In addition, each incumbent will be afforded an opportunity to propose license modifications that it prefers, so long as those modifications also serve the public interest by satisfying certain restrictions. In either case, the modified licenses will increase the incumbent's opportunities to provide advanced services. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and the Office of Economics and Analytics recommend adoption of this fourth report and order and request editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan, for the presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, we implement a process to modify and rationalize existing 39 gigahertz licenses, which will enable incumbent licensees to provide next-generation services. By adopting an incentive auction format for these bands, incumbents will have the choice and flexibility to either keep or expand on their spectrum holdings in a market or sell their licenses to other auction participants. This model should ensure that licenses go to those that value them the most and are most likely to deploy next-generation services. While I acknowledge this is not the simplest of processes, we must accept the reality we face. Here, as in other bands, we look to repurpose incumbents' varying spectrum holdings often do not fit neatly in any workable geographic area for providing 5G services. Ultimately, this entire item highlights the difficulties in the innovative lengths to which we will go to find clean spectrum. To make the large-scale investments required for new technologies, licensees continue and appropriately want cleared, exclusive-use licenses covering significant geographic areas. While some have visions of a permanent move to a sharing paradigm, clean licensed spectrum has been the hallmark of our spectrum policy in the past and will continue to be going forward. However, using creative mechanisms like this one to create exclusive-use licenses may become more of a mainstay. Finally, this agency has put countless hours opening these millimeter wave bands and others for next-generation services. These decisions were based on public comment, negotiations between federal agencies, satellite providers, and the wireless industry, and studies regarding how incumbent services can coexist with new terrestrial uses. Companies have made spectrum investments in reliance on our prior adopted orders. Any attempt to undermine these decisions cannot be tolerated. The U.S. needs to finalize its World Radio Communication Conference proposals to advocate for global harmonization of this band. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thank you. A few minutes from now, the Commission will complete the 59th round of bidding for spectrum in the 28 gigahertz band. It's the FCC's first ever high-band 5G auction, and the results thus far are promising. The auction has already yielded nearly $700 million in provisionally winning bids, and that's despite some unique constraints on this particular auction. For one, much of the band was licensed before the auction started. Most of the license areas include incumbents, and what's left contains less than a quarter of the country's population. For another, auctioning millimeter wave spectrum is uncharted territory, and there was some uncertainty in the market about the spectrum's value and use case. So why is there so much demand for this spectrum? It's because brilliant engineers have done what they always do: invent, innovate, and make it work. In fact, one wireless provider is already using the 28 gigahertz band to offer service to families who feel for the first time they have a choice in home broadband. When it announced plans to build out that service, the provider said it could get up to a gigabit speed delivered over a distance of maybe 1,500 feet or a few city blocks. The engineers continued testing, and they extended that range to 2,000 feet through foliage, varied weather conditions, and even without line of sight. Last week, the provider announced another breakthrough. It can deliver peak speeds of 2 to 4 gigabits per second up to a half mile from its small cells, bouncing the signal off structures and through trees. In short, we can do more with millimeter wave spectrum than we originally thought. And that's great news for the rollout of 5G services. It's great news for the millions of Americans who want more providers to compete for their broadband dollars. Next up after 28 gigahertz is the 24 gigahertz band, which is greenfield, almost wholly unencumbered spectrum. And through the item before us today, we set the stage for 3 additional millimeter wave auctions in 2019. This plan will result in more spectrum being auctioned in a single year than at any time in the Commission's history. It's a full calendar for sure. And it couldn't come at a better moment either. All of our nationwide carriers plan to deploy 5G next year. So 2019 will see the first 5G smartphone, the first commercial launch of 5G on low-band spectrum, and the first truly mobile 5G service. Put simply, 2019 will be the year of 5G. And this is due in part to the Commission's decisions to open up more spectrum for this technology. To continue winning this race to 5G, we must keep up efforts like those that produced this item. So I want to thank the hardworking team in the Wireless Bureau for their work on it. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
This decision sets the stage for the FCC to auction the largest swath of contiguous spectrum for 5G services yet. With an auction planned for 2019, airwaves in the 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands will be primed and ready for the first generation of 5G devices. This is exciting. Even better, the approach we adopt here puts a premium on auctioning millimeter wave bands together instead of one by one. That's a method I have long championed, and I appreciate that my colleagues have recognized that this is the right way to go. In addition, we grant incumbents the opportunity to trade in their existing spectrum rights in the 39 gigahertz band in exchange for new rights in any of the bands we offer in this auction. This promises to generate more interest and provide bidders with more freedom to assess which bands work best for them. This has also been an approach I have argued for from the start, and I think, as a result, a more thoughtful auction is in our future. However, as we hurry to increase the licensed spectrum in the pipeline available for 5G service, I believe there should be a cut for unlicensed too. In the past, I've called this the Wi-Fi dividend. I believe good spectrum policy requires a mix of licensed and unlicensed services. Here today, we have done just that by committing in 2019 to advance unlicensed opportunities in the lower 37 gigahertz band. This band was designated for innovative shared use under a license by rule regime, but requires additional work on a coordination mechanism. I appreciate that my colleagues have supported my request to expedite this effort. For these reasons, this order has my full and enthusiastic support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Pushing more spectrum into the commercial marketplace is a key component of our 5G FAST plan to maintain American leadership in the next generation of wireless connectivity. Currently, as Commissioner Carr observed, we are conducting an auction of 28 gigahertz band spectrum to be followed by an auction of 24 gigahertz band spectrum. And today we are taking a critical step toward holding an auction of the upper 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands in 2019. These and other steps will help us stay ahead of the spectrum curve and allow wireless innovation to thrive on our shores. And notably, we are setting up the upper 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz auction to be our second ever incentive auction. Now, this incentive auction will be different from the broadcast incentive auction that Congress authorized years ago, but it'll have the same worthy goal: clearing or repacking existing licensees to make spectrum as useful as possible, boosting competition, and benefiting consumers. In this order, we also take a number of steps to facilitate this auction. First, we harmonize the block size to 100 megahertz for all three bands. This will make it easier to both transition incumbents with mismatched license holdings and auction all of these bands together. Next, we enable incumbent licensees to rationalize their spectrum holdings and new licensees to gain meaningful access to millimeter wave spectrum. And at multiple steps along the way, we let incumbents choose how to relinquish or modify their existing rights, which ensures that they will be treated fairly. I'm pleased that the Commission is committed to making these bands available in 2019 to facilitate American leadership in 5G and provide additional opportunities for consumers across the country to access advanced wireless services. It's part of an ambitious auction schedule that will push almost 5 gigahertz of spectrum into the commercial marketplace in late 2018 and 2019. As always, I would like to thank the staff who worked on this item from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the new Office of Economics and Analytics, and the Office of General Counsel. It was terrific work, and there is still more to come, of course. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks for the great work. Madam Associate Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, the next item will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau and is entitled Connect America Fund, ETC Annual Reports and Certifications, Establishing Just and Reasonable Rates for Local Exchange Carriers, Developing a Unified Intercarrier Compensation Regime. Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Associate Secretary. And Ms. Monteith, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
Today, the Wireline Competition Bureau presents for your consideration a report and order, further notice of proposed rulemaking, and order on reconsideration. The item focuses on the nation's rate of return carriers, and if adopted, will continue the Commission's efforts to bridge the digital divide in order to bring economic opportunity, job creation, education, and civic engagement to rural parts of the country. Rural Americans have access to fixed, terrestrial, high-speed internet of at least 25 megabits per second download, 3 megabits per second upload, the Commission's current speed benchmark, at much lower levels than their urban counterparts. The gap between broadband access in rural and urban areas is unacceptable. We must do better, and this item is an important next step in the Commission's efforts. I would like to thank the staff of the Telecommunications Access Policy Division and the former Industry Analysis and Technology Division for their hard work on this item. I would also like to acknowledge the valuable input we received from our colleagues on the Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force and in the Office of General Counsel. Seated with me at the table from the Wireline Competition Bureau are Sue McNeil, Associate Chief, and from the Telecommunications Access Policy Division, Ryan Palmer, Chief, Alex Menard, Deputy Chief, Suzanne Yellen, Assistant Chief, and Ted Burmeister and Jesse Jackman, Attorney Advisors. Jesse will now present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The report and order before you marks an important next step in closing the digital divide by recognizing that access to 25.3 megabits per second broadband service is not a luxury for urban areas, but important to Americans wherever they live. To that end, this item would adopt additional measures with the goal of expanding the availability of affordable broadband service to rural America. First, the item authorizes another model offer to those rate of return carriers currently receiving Alternative Connect America cost model support for additional funding if they commit to building out to more locations at speeds of at least 25.3 megabits per second. Second, the item authorizes a new model offer to those carriers currently on legacy support in return for specifically tailored obligations to build out broadband networks providing speeds of at least 25.3 megabits per second for all fully funded locations. Third, for those rate of return carriers that elect to remain on legacy support, the item would adopt a new separate budget based on 2018 uncapped claims, increased by inflation annually, with an additional one-time upward adjustment in 2019 related to increases in the number of broadband-only lines. Moreover, all legacy carriers would have new deployment obligations that require speeds of at least 25.3 megabits per second, an increase from 10.1 megabits per second. At the same time, the item would adopt measures to mitigate regulatory burdens on providers and encourage the efficient use of universal service support. This item also includes a further notice of proposed rulemaking, seeking comment on how to implement an auction mechanism for competitive overlap in certain legacy rate of return areas, seeking comment on issues related to the increasing number of broadband-only lines, and seeking comment on additional support for legacy carriers serving tribal lands. Finally, an order on reconsideration in this item would deny 3 petitions seeking reconsideration of the Commission's March 2018 decision authorizing additional support for certain ACAM carriers. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges with respect to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jackman, for your presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a much longer statement for the record, but I'll just make a couple points. Throughout my tenure as a commissioner and one of the leaders of the 2016 Rate of Return Reform Order, I've been incredibly engaged in pushing for Universal Service Fund reforms to promote broadband deployment in unserved areas while minimizing burdens on ratepayers. Some principles I have long championed are advanced by this item, particularly budget sufficiency and predictability for legacy and alternative Connect America cost model carriers. Despite deep concerns on the new ACAM 2 model, the tribal broadband factor, and reliance on Form 477 data, I'm grateful for the strides we make today in delivering certainty and sufficiency to the budget for rate of return carriers. While a significant portion of this item is devoted to buying higher speeds for those who may already have some degree of broadband, we must keep in mind that substantial areas of the country remain without service at all. With resolution of this item, I look forward to finally turning the Commission's focus next year to implementing the long-awaited Remote Areas Fund auction, as required by the USF ICC Transformation Order, to bring broadband service to the costliest and hardest to serve areas. Connecting the unserved can now be our foremost priority, and much more work remains in furtherance of that goal. I will support the item, and I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. 2 months ago, I visited a community that Business Insider lists as one of 11 cities millennials have moved to in drones over the past few years. It has a bespoke and popular bike share network, of course. And not surprisingly, it has a thriving tech and startup scene with gigabit speed broadband. In fact, year over year, venture capital funding just increased by nearly $1 billion across the region. It's not Seattle, and it's certainly not San Jose. It's Fargo, North Dakota, which is part of the Midwest's growing Silicon Prairie. In Fargo, I met with entrepreneurs in one of the city's startup spaces who are developing IoT and other cutting-edge technologies. One project they're working on is setting up the first fully autonomous farm. Up the road, I visited one of the country's leading research and development facilities for drones and other unmanned aerial systems. And just down the Red River, I met with some of the largest job creators in the small town of Abercrombie. This included a visit with Tom and Rory, who run a food processing and packaging plant. They told me the same thing I heard on every stop across Silicon Prairie. Their jobs and their businesses simply wouldn't be there today without high-speed internet access. So when we talk about bringing more broadband to more Americans, we're talking about all of this innovation and all of this economic opportunity that broadband enables. Our Universal Service Fund is a key part of the solution in communities like this. Communities where low population densities and high deployment costs erode the private sector business case. That's why my office pushed hard for the Commission to adopt this order and to provide the sufficient and predictable levels of support that ISPs serving rural America need to deploy broadband. So I'd like to thank the chairman and his staff for bringing this order forward and for taking my feedback into account in doing so. This decision will have a real impact on extending broadband and economic opportunity in rural communities throughout the country. So I want to thank the staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau as well for your hard work on this item. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
I will have a statement for the record, but in the interest of moving us along, I will just say that I appreciate your efforts to update and refine universal service. Thank the staff for its work and acknowledge that this item has my full support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Today, we take a major step towards closing the digital divide. The trees, so to speak, are thick. We are substantially reforming the high-cost universal service support program for some of the country's smallest rural carriers, and the program's rules are complicated, to say the least. But the forest here is easy to see. We are helping to ensure that rural Americans can participate in the digital economy. We're changing the system for rural carriers and consumers alike in three basic ways, and each will result in material improvements for rural connectivity. The first involves so-called ACAM carriers, named for the Alternative Connect America cost model that is used to calculate their support and that they opted into a few years ago. Now, these carriers receive fixed amounts of support based on economic modeling of their costs for deploying and maintaining broadband in their service areas. These carriers were initially required to deploy 1 megabit per second service to certain locations that were predicted to cost below $200 per month to serve. And due to budgetary limits at the time, that $200 per month per location figure was reduced to less than $150. And so today, we are increasing the support available to these carriers back to the intended maximum of $200 per location. But critically, this increase is now tied to requirements that those carriers deploy 25/3 megabit per second service, the FCC's definition of broadband, to additional locations in their service areas. This will mean full digital opportunity for more than 100,000 homes and businesses. No small feat. The second set of reforms extends a new offer of model-based support to rate of return carriers that didn't accept the first offer. Now, however, here too, we include meaningful new obligations that will benefit rural consumers. For example, carriers electing this offer will be required to deploy 25/3 megabit per second broadband to all locations in their service areas, for which the ACAM model predicts it'll cost $200 or less to serve. Additionally, this new offer supports deployment to rural areas that would not have been eligible for support in the 2016 offer. Carriers serving tribal lands will also get more support because we consider and recognize the challenges of building broadband networks in those areas. The third set of reforms offers stability for those rate of return carriers that choose to remain on legacy cost-based support, that is, those that declined model-based support then and will do so again. During the previous administration, these carriers faced a serious lack of predictability in their budgets, unpredictability that delayed new deployments. But today, we ensure sufficient funding will be available going forward. But again, like their cohorts choosing model-based support, with increased funding comes increased responsibility. These carriers, too, will also have to deploy 25/3 service to new locations in their service areas. The bottom line here is this. As a result of today's order, many more rural Americans will have access to high-speed broadband service that will enable them to fully participate in the digital economy, to engage in entrepreneurship and telemedicine and precision agriculture and online education and civic engagement and much, much more. And I would like to extend my gratitude to the staff that worked tirelessly on this very complicated item. From the Wireline Competition Bureau, Pam Arlick, Ted Burmeister, Joe Calashone, Talmadge Cox, James Eisner, Justin Falb, Victoria Goldberg, Atula Gunaratna, Lisa Hone, Jesse Jackman, Sue McNeil, Alex Menard, Chris Monteith, Ryan Palmer, Eric Ralph, Steve Rosenberg, Doug Slaughton, Gilbert Smith, Joe Cereso, Craig Stroup, and Suzanne Yellen. And from the Office of General Counsel, Melina Barzilai, Ashley Boisel, Tom Johnson, Rick Mallon, Linda Oliver, and Bill Richardson. This was not an easy task, to say the least, but you discharged your responsibilities with aplomb, and the country will be better off for your efforts. Thank you. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
I approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks again for all the legwork. We will, Madam Secretary, Associate Secretary, sorry, could you please announce the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the third item is entitled Advanced Methods to Target and Eliminate Unlawful Robocalls and will be presented by the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. Patrick Weber, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Sounds good. Mr. Weber, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today I am pleased to introduce an item that addresses the long-standing problem of calls to reassigned telephone numbers. Millions of numbers are reassigned each year, subjecting many consumers to unwanted calls and causing other consumers to miss calls they expect. And this is not just a consumer problem. Unwanted calls to reassign numbers also waste the time and resources of responsible callers, like banks, doctors' offices, and schools, that are trying to get important, timely information to consumers. The item before you establishes a comprehensive database allowing callers to avoid dialing reassigned numbers. The database has the support of callers and consumer groups alike and is another important step in curbing the tide of unwanted calls. Before turning the presentation over to CGB staff, I would like to thank the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of General Counsel, and the Office of Communications Business Opportunities for their valuable assistance. With me this morning are Kurt Schroeder, Chief of CGB's Consumer Policy Division, John B. Adams, Deputy Chief, and Josh Zeldis, Attorney Advisor in the division. Josh will present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
The second report in order before you addresses the problem of unwanted calls to reassign numbers. When a phone number is reassigned to a new consumer, that person may receive calls intended for the consumer who previously had that number. These calls are a nuisance to the consumers who receive them, deprive the consumer who previously had the number of an expected call, and waste the time and effort of the callers. Up until now, there's been no comprehensive resource for callers to detect a reassignment before making a call. Callers, consumer groups, and legislators have all asked for a single comprehensive database to solve the problem, and the item before you achieves that. First, it establishes a single database containing the most recent permanent disconnection data for each number allocated to voice providers, including toll-free numbers. It requires that this information be updated monthly, and, combined with a new 45-day minimum waiting period for reassigning numbers, ensures callers can discover a disconnection and avoid calling a reassigned number. Next, the order establishes efficient administration and funding mechanisms. Startup costs will be defrayed by voice provider contributions to be recouped through user fees once the database is operational. It refers technical and operational issues, including a usage fee framework, to the North American Numbering Council. Finally, the order grants callers a safe harbor from liability for any database errors that lead to a call to a reassigned number, It also allows voice providers serving fewer than 100,000 lines additional time to begin maintaining and reporting data to the database. We recommend adoption of this item and request editorial privileges to make technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zeller, for the presentation. We'll begin with Commissioner O'Reilly for any comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier this year, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit took a welcome step in restoring common sense to our agency's interpretation of the TCPA. Among other matters, the court vacated the misguided 2015 decision to impose liability on callers that attempt to reach a consenting party, but whose wireless number has become reassigned without the caller's knowledge, apart from an arbitrary and capricious one-call safe harbor. Other than creating a windfall for plaintiffs' lawyers, the irrational one-call rule did nothing to solve the problem of reassigned numbers and instead imposed unfair harms on legitimate companies seeking to offer legitimate services to interested customers. This order seeks to undo the previous Commission's defective approach to reassigned numbers by establishing a new comprehensive reassigned numbers database. As I've stated in the past, my preference would have been to utilize existing commercial available databases which have improved in recent years and offer legal protection to those that exist. Our action does not necessarily crowd out those efforts, and there's a chance competition among offerings may develop and produce interesting results. Moreover, to the extent that the purpose of creating the database is to insulate users from liability, it would have been better or more fitting, in my opinion, to first address the definition of called party in the context of TCPA. After all, shouldn't the Commission decide to rightfully redefine called party as the intended recipient of the call rather than the subscriber of the number, the legal liability basis for establishing the database would significantly dissipate. However, I respect the Chairman's decision to take the current approach and have been promised that a comprehensive redo of the TCPA rules will be considered promptly. Additionally, I'm grateful to his office for working with me to insert, at my request, a robust safe harbor in this item. The cost of creating, maintaining, and using the database will be significant, and we simply cannot justify it without providing a corresponding benefit to callers who pay to use it. In all reality, this database will always be imperfect, meaning despite our actions effectively requiring callers to use it, users will still need to be shielded from pointless lawsuits. This is a critical improvement to the item. While our action today helps in addressing abusive and predatory TCPA litigation, I do remain concerned about the cost of the database for service providers and users. Lessons from the private sector have taught us that requisite database dips to verify reassignment can become cost prohibitive for businesses. Moreover, as structured in the order, data dips are likely to surge at certain times and require additional investments by the administrator in server capacity to handle peak traffic days, the cost of which will be ultimately borne by users. I urge Nancy, to whom we have delegated substantial direct discretion to develop a database administration plan, to focus on minimizing costs and burden for users and service providers and ensuring that it is reasonably affordable for all to use. I also thank the Chairman for agreeing to conduct a comment process in response to Nancy's recommendation and to solicit feedback in response to paperwork burdens imposed by the technical requirements document. Further, while I am hopeful that the database will accomplish its intended purpose, it would be naive to think that it will comprehensively fix the reassigned numbers problem. In forming our expectations, we should be wise to keep in mind the costly and ineffective Do Not Call registry, which never stopped bad actors from targeting those on the list. Let's accept fate that ultimately only the honest and legitimate callers will consult the reassigned numbers database, not the criminals or the scammers. Today's action is a positive development in reversing the previous Commission's deeply flawed 2015 TCPA order. However, much work remains, particularly on narrowing the prior Commission's ludicrous definition of auto dialer and eliminating the lawless revocation of consent rule. I'm optimistic that our next steps will go a long way in reading the TCPA in a logical way and limiting wasteful and frivolous TCPA litigation that does nothing to protect consumers or stop illegal robocalls. I will vote to approve. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thank you. When I walk down the street in my neighborhood, there are two issues that result in my neighbors throwing open their windows and lobbying me from their houses, or yelling at me is probably more appropriate description. The first, of course, is robocalls. The second is loud television commercials. Still get lots of complaints about that. With today's decision, I can tell Mr. Henry that we're making progress on at least one of those issues. And that progress is part of a broader effort at the Commission. Starting last year, the FCC elevated robocalls to our top enforcement priority. And we've imposed major fines on parties engaged in large-scale spoofing operations. We adopted new rules that allow phone companies to block fraudulent calls. We took steps toward adopting a call authentication framework to help ensure the validity of caller ID information. Just a few weeks ago, Chairman Pai called on providers to adopt this authentication framework as soon as possible. And with the steps we take today, we adopt a better approach to dealing with reassigned numbers. This issue arises when a consumer gives a business permission to call them, but their telephone number is subsequently reassigned to another consumer. In fact, I had a version of this happen to me when I started at the FCC a few years back. The mobile phone our IT team gave me had recently been turned in by another employee. So I got a lot of calls meant for her. And look, I don't want to call that person out, but I will say, Jennifer Manor, if you're still missing phone calls, I'm happy to give you an update next time you stop by the Commission. Today, though, we address the broader issue by creating a single database that lets businesses determine whether a number has been reassigned. And to ensure that businesses have the incentive to use that database, I and others asked that we include a safe harbor provision in today's decision. So I'm glad that we're including it today. In the end, this decision will help cut down on the number of unwanted calls that all of us, my neighbors included, receive. It's not going to end the scourge of robocalls completely. We're doing a lot of work to try to get to that result. So it has my support. I want to thank the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau for your work on the item. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
I detest robocalls. I know my colleagues do too. So does anyone and everyone I know. It's no wonder, because there were 5 billion robocalls nationwide last month. That's more than double the amount of robocalls we had at the start of last year. If this is a battle, consumers are on the side that's losing. Whatever we are doing right now at the Federal Communications Commission to prevent this onslaught, it's not enough. So sign me up for today's effort. I support this decision. It promises to cut down on one discrete segment of unwanted calls, those made to reassigned numbers. But here's the thing. The database we established today won't be up and running anytime soon. There is no deadline for its implementation, no date by which we can ensure its operation, and no time by which we can ensure consumers' relief. We need help now. We have a crisis on our hands. The explosive increase in robocalls is systematically eroding public trust in our networks. At the same time, today there are call identification and blocking tools that many service providers offer to consumers, some at no charge. I think, in light of this crisis, they should be available to every consumer for free. Collectively, we can restore faith in our network and restore sanity to those on the receiving end of these nuisance calls. Because I'm tired of waiting, this morning I sent letters to major providers of voice service requesting they make robocall blocking tools available to every consumer at no cost. We are in an arms race, and everyone with a phone is behind in the battle against robocalls. It's time to even the fight. I hope my colleagues will join me in this effort.
Thank you, Commissioner. The problem is a simple one. A doctor's office is trying to reach a patient. It calls what it thinks is the patient's phone number. But the patient has changed numbers, and her old phone number has been reassigned to somebody else. So someone with no relationship to the doctor's office or the patient receives the call. Now, this isn't good for anyone. The new holder of the number is annoyed by a call that is meant for someone else. The patient misses out on what could be an important call from her doctor's office. And the doctor's office is unable to reach the patient and could face a lawsuit under the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, or TCPA, for unknowingly placing the call in question. Now, of course, this scenario applies to a wide range of businesses and customers beyond doctors' offices and patients. And avoiding it benefits everybody. It's good for individuals who receive a new phone number. It's good for individuals changing phone numbers, and it's good for businesses. And so today we adopt a solution that will reduce the number of mistaken calls to reassigned numbers. Specifically, we are establishing a single, comprehensive, and timely database of phone numbers that have been reassigned. This reassigned numbers database will enable callers to verify before calling a number whether it has been permanently disconnected and is therefore eligible for reassignment. In other words, they'll be able to avoid calling numbers that have been or could have been reassigned to somebody else. Each month, voice providers and the toll-free numbering administrator will report information to the database regarding permanently disconnected numbers. And as an added safeguard to protect both legitimate callers and consumers, we require a minimum aging period of 45 days before permanently disconnected telephone numbers can be reassigned. Now, establishing a comprehensive and timely reassigned numbers database has received broad and bipartisan support. For example, Senate Commerce Committee Chairman John Thune and Senator Ed Markey recently said that, and I quote, "A reassigned numbers database could curb the increase in unwanted calls and texts and also provide more certainty to legitimate callers seeking to communicate important information to their patients, customers, or employees." We applaud the Commission for their effort to create this database and support its swift implementation. And the database has the backing of consumer groups and trade associations representing a variety of constituents as well. Now, some important administrative notes. This database will be managed by an independent third-party administrator selected through a competitive bidding process. And that administrator will receive information about permanently disconnected numbers from reporting providers. To ease the burden on small providers, we allow them an additional 6 months to begin reporting to the database administrator. Finally, we adopt a safe harbor from TCPA liability for those callers that rely on the database to learn if a number has been reassigned. This will ensure that a responsible caller who uses this database will not be held liable for accidentally making a call to a reassigned number because of a database error. Now, zooming out, there is no silver bullet to end this scourge of robocalls. And that is why this FCC is pursuing a comprehensive strategy that includes call authentication, call blocking, strong enforcement action, and today, a reassigned numbers database. Each is an important tool to help us rid Americans' phones of unwanted calls. And I'm personally very grateful to the staff of the bureaus and offices for the hard work on the second report and order, in particular to the staffs of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, the Office of General Counsel, what was the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Analysis, the Wireline Competition Bureau, and the Office of Communications Business Opportunities. We'll now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approved.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Support.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff for the terrific work on this item. Madam Associate Secretary, could you please announce the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, item 4 will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and is entitled Petitions for Declaratory Ruling on Regulatory Status of Wireless Messaging Service. Once again, Donald Stockdale, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Welcome back, Mr. Stockdale. The floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, now I am pleased to present to you a declaratory ruling that would classify 2 forms of wireless messaging services as information services. I am joined at the table today by Garnet Hanley, Daryl Pay, and Dana Schaefer of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. In addition to the staff at the table, I would like to thank the Commission staff listed on the slide for their input. Darrell will now present the item.
Thanks, Don. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
We present to you today a declaratory ruling that would classify certain text messaging services as information services and would deny two petitions asking the Commission to declare that text messaging services are telecommunication services and commercial mobile services as those terms are defined in the Communications Act. This declaratory ruling would classify short message service, known as SMS, and multimedia messaging service, known as MMS, as information services, not telecommunication services, under the Act because SMS and MMS involve the information processing capabilities contained in the definition of information service. This declaratory ruling also would conclude that SMS and MMS do not meet the statutory definition of commercial mobile services because they do not provide interconnected service. Further, the declaratory ruling would find that SMS and MMS are not the functional equivalent of commercial mobile services because, among other reasons, consumers do not view SMS and MMS as closely substitutable for voice service. The classification decision in this declaratory ruling would remove regulatory uncertainty and empower wireless messaging providers to continue protecting American consumers from unwanted text messages, including spam and scam robotexts. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges to make technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pei, for your presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. The classification of texting as an interstate information service is a policy decision for which I have long and vociferously advocated. Text messaging clearly meets that relevant statutory definition and does not fall within the definition of telecommunications services, or even commercial mobile services. Even in the last instance, text messaging applications are not interconnected, as only those with text-enabled mobile handsets receive these texts. Based on a straightforward statutory interpretation, text messaging should not be subject to common carrier treatment, but ought to be rightfully treated as an information service. Moving away from legalese, wireless providers and their customers deserve the certainty, flexibility, and regulatory environment afforded to a Title I service in order to avoid new burdens on existing services and invest, innovate, and deploy the next generation of text messaging services. This action also allows providers to compete effectively with instant messaging services, including WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, and others that dominate the market. In fact, one report asserts that over-the-top applications make up approximately 75% of all text messages. Of course, these apps are completely outside the purview of the Commission's regulatory tentacles. Our action here clarifies that the text messaging services provided by wireless providers will be treated similarly. I appreciate that today's version of the order includes language about the long-standing national policy of not regulating information services, both in the economic and public utility sense, or if established by states. What this means is that the Commission will exert its preemption authority over states when necessary to ensure that the appropriate classification is properly recognized. Further, I'm pleased that my colleagues agreed to add language to this item that successor technologies with similar characteristics to SMS and MMS, including RCS, would be expected to be considered information services. The next generation of texting services is on the near horizon, and without this statement, our action today will be out of date in the very near future. For these reasons, I strongly support and will vote to approve this item. Now we've taken this important step, however, I'm hopeful that the Commission will also seek to expand this appropriate classification to the treatment of VoIP and VoLTE. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Today, we take the very common sense step of clarifying that SMS and MMS text messaging services are, like WhatsApp, like Snapchat, like iMessage, not Title II telecom services. This is clearly the right answer as a matter of law and of policy, as we've heard from a broad cross-section of commenters, from state attorneys general to consumer advocates like American Consumer Institute to nonpartisan think tanks like the Free State Foundation. In fact, today's decision marks no sea change. It simply codifies the status quo, one that has allowed innovative messaging services to launch and compete with one another to meet consumer demand. Yet, none of that, not the facts, not the law, none of that matters to those interested in the partisan politics of dissent. Instead, they describe this decision as radical and Orwellian. But false and apocalyptic rhetoric is simply standard fare for this crowd. When Congress passed the Broadband Privacy Resolution, they told us that ISPs would start selling our web browsing histories. That claim was false then, and it's false now. When the FCC adopted our net neutrality decision last year, they told us that ISPs would have free rein to dictate our online experience and end the internet as we know it. That claim was false then, and it's false now. So when we confirm that SMS text messages, like WhatsApp messages, are not Title II telecom services, it's no surprise that these same groups trot out their sky is falling rhetoric again. And it's no surprise that their claims will be proven false again. Tomorrow, like today, our text messages will go through. We'll have the clarity that heavy-handed government regulation won't apply. And we help providers ensure that the scourge of robocalls doesn't become the curse of robotexts. This will encourage the continued investment in innovation in these and future services that Americans want. So for my part, I want to thank the staff of the Wireless Bureau for your hard work on this item. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Some years back, famed American linguist William Lutz sat down for an hour-long interview with C-SPAN. At one point, during what was a wide-ranging discussion, he tells a story about a garbage dump, or to be more precise, a Kansas City proposal to build a new garbage dump. Everything about the story is pretty unremarkable, except for one thing. In order to curb dissent from residents, as Lutz tells it, the dump was presented as a resource development park. Now, it doesn't take a linguist to put the truth to that lie. A dump by any other name is still a dump. In telling this story, Lutz was illustrating a classic linguistic trick used to manipulate listeners. It was actually the title of a book he wrote called Doublespeak. According to Lutz, doublespeak is language designed to evade responsibility, make the unpleasant appear pleasant, and the unattractive appear attractive. Lutz goes on to offer a prescient warning that this type of purposeful rhetoric is especially dangerous when used by lawmakers. That's because language used this way can be corrupting in a democracy that depends on the active participation of its citizens. It can lead to cynicism, it can breed resentment, and it can tire citizens into withdrawing from the political process entirely. You can't say he didn't warn us. But I fear his words are being ignored. These days, across Washington, it feels like we are awash in doublespeak. It feels like this agency is becoming part of the problem. Take today's declaratory ruling. In it, the FCC continues its quest to dismantle the regulatory frameworks that protect Americans and that are intended to make phone, cable, and internet service more fair and more affordable. We do that here by considering a petition that asks us to affirm what should be obvious, that text messaging is telecommunications, which is to say that when you send a text, You expect that your carrier will send it where you want it to go without changing its content or blocking it. It's that simple. But instead of using this common sense approach, this agency does the opposite. We twist the law to reach the conclusion that you no longer have the final say on where your text messages go and what they say. That means your carrier now has the legal right to block your text messages and censor the very content of your messages. If that sounds familiar, it should. This agency did the same thing with internet service last year. That means on the one-year anniversary of the FCC's misguided net neutrality decision, which gave your broadband provider the power to block websites and censor online content, this agency is celebrating by expanding those powers to also include your text messages. I'm not celebrating, because instead of being upfront about what is really happening, the FCC buries the lead by declaring this decision is all about robocalls. That's dishonest. It's irresponsible. Carriers are already fully empowered by this agency to protect consumers from unwanted junk text messages. The FCC has made this abundantly clear in prior rulings. And as the Washington Post explained in an editorial just over a week ago, the approach we take now does not newly empower consumers, it empowers companies instead by letting them censor content at their whim rather than at the consumer's will. At the same time, this approach makes a range of key FCC policies newly vulnerable, from roaming obligations to universal service. But you will find no discussion of these harms in today's decision. You will only find misleading commentary suggesting this new right to block and censor texts is somehow good for consumers. Unfortunately, this kind of approach is growing familiar in these halls. Today's decision is brought to you by the same agency that rolled back net neutrality rules and called it restoring internet freedom. Today's decision is from the same agency that sought to take a broadband subsidy away from low-income individuals across the country and called it bridging the digital divide for low-income consumers. And today's decision comes from the same agency that described its decision to preempt the rule of localities in wireless siting and called it reaffirming local control over wireless infrastructure. Enough. At the FCC, in Washington, and across the country, we can no longer afford to be passive consumers of such deceptive language. We can no longer sit idly by when those in power tell us from above what is happening, but the facts on the ground make it so obviously wrong. It saddens me that this agency is not immune from this broader trend. When evasive language becomes all too familiar, telling the truth can feel revolutionary. So here it is. Today's decision offers consumers no new ability to prevent robotexts. It simply provides that carriers can block our text messages and censor the very content of the messages themselves. Calling this decision anything else is doublespeak. I dissent.
Thanks, Commissioner. If you receive a text message right now, the chances are that you are going to read it. In fact, statistics show that it is a near certainty. Consumers open 98% of the short message service or SMS messages they receive, and they open 90% of them almost immediately upon receipt. And that is numerical proof that Americans trust and rely on text messaging. And one reason why is that wireless providers prevent large volumes of unwanted or malicious text traffic from reaching consumers' phones. They do this by applying filters, blocking robotexts, and using anti-spoofing measures, among other things. And they've been successful, considering that a mere 3% of SMS messages are spam. By comparison, voice robocalls are driving everyone crazy, including me, and for years they've constituted the #1 category of consumer complaints to the FCC. But some want the FCC to curtail these efforts to combat unwanted text messages. Specifically, they want the FCC to classify text messaging as a telecommunications service under Title II of the Communications Act, which would open the floodgates to spam texts. Today, we reject this request and instead side firmly with consumers by classifying SMS and Multimedia Messaging Service, or MMS, as information services and empowering wireless providers to continue taking action against unwanted text messages. Now, this decision is right on the law. Just read the declaratory ruling's painstaking analysis of the statutory terms and the nature of text messaging, and you'll understand why. But it is also sound policy. The FCC should not make it easier for spammers and scammers to bombard consumers with unwanted texts. And we shouldn't allow unwanted messages to plague wireless messaging services in the same way that unwanted robocalls flood voice services. But that is precisely what would happen if we were to classify text messaging services as telecommunications services and subject them to common carrier regulation under Title II, as mass texting companies and others have asked us to do. Now, notwithstanding the rhetoric, the overwhelming support from unusually diverse quarters demonstrates that our approach benefits consumers. Take the bipartisan group of 20 state attorneys general, from the Democratic Attorney General of Connecticut to the Republican Attorney General of Idaho, all of whom told the FCC, and I quote, "We believe in our citizens' desire that this unique wireless service should be kept spam-free. We therefore urge the Commission to maintain the status quo rather than imposing new regulatory structures that would open the spam floodgates." Or take the National Organization of Black Elected Legislative Women, which told us that, and I quote, "Removing the current regulatory framework would open up our constituents to a torrent of unwanted text messages, exposing them to harmful spam and fraud in the process." Or take the National Organization of Black County Officials, which told us that, and I quote, "We agree with the Federal Communications Commission's proposed order to ensure messaging remains a protected environment for NOBCO's constituents. This would allow wireless companies to continue their service by filtering out fraudulent or unwanted text messages that their customers do not want." Or take the respected public safety organization, NENA, the 911 Association, which cited the, quote, "impact that such a decision could have on access to crucial emergency communication services, such as text to 911. NENA also warned that if, quote, "either consumers or worse yet, public safety answering points are inundated with unwanted messages, either cohort could withdraw from widespread use of the SMS platform." Or take the National Association of Neighborhoods, which told us that Title II classification, quote, "would expose our membership to unwanted spam and unsafe or fraudulent messaging. The Commission has the opportunity to better protect citizens without implementing unnecessary regulation of wireless carriers by allowing wireless carriers to filter messages. This is the best approach for the communications needs and safety of our neighborhoods." Or take the National Black Caucus of State Legislators, which requested the Commission, quote, "keep consumers' mobile text messaging experiences free from unwarranted solicitations and deny the petition to subject mobile messages to Title II oversight." Or take the American Enterprise Institute, which told us that this ruling, quote, "would preserve regulatory parity between text messaging and other services that consumers view as substitutes to texting. Internet-based messaging services such as WhatsApp and iMessage are lightly regulated information services under the Act." Or take Citizens Against Government Waste, which told us that the FCC, quote, "will take an important step in allowing wireless messaging providers to protect consumers from such scams through the application of robotext blocking, anti-spoofing measures, and other anti-spam features." Or, in what may be the most amazing statement of all, take Twilio itself, which suggested changes to the Commission's description of its services, but made clear that these changes, quote, "do not affect the analysis or conclusion reflected in the draft order." Yes, that is right. One of the petitioners in this very proceeding itself does not dispute our reasoning or results, which in my book is pretty strong evidence that we are on the right track. And so this FCC agrees with a spectacularly broad range of stakeholders, from the Democratic Attorney General of Connecticut to consumer advocates across the country. And we refuse to let spam texts infest American consumers' phones. Instead, we classify SMS and MMS as information services and enable wireless providers to continue taking steps to limit spam and ensure that text messaging remains a trusted form of communications for millions of Americans. In short, we stand with the American consumer, not with those trying to bombard him or her with spam or scam robotexts. Thank you to the Commission's dedicated staff from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of General Counsel, the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, and the Enforcement Bureau for the terrific work on this item. It has my support. We'll now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Dissent.
The chair votes to approve. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff for the great work. Madam Associate Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, Item 5, entitled 2018 Quadrennial Regulatory Review, review of the Commission's broadcast ownership rules and other rules adopted pursuant to Section 202 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, will be presented by the Media Bureau, and Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Associate Secretary. Ms. Carey, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The Media Bureau is pleased to present a notice of proposed rulemaking that commences the 2018 quadrennial review of the Commission's broadcast ownership rules. This notice seeks comment on whether the Commission should retain, modify, or eliminate certain broadcast ownership rules, given the current state of the media marketplace. Joining me at the table are Sarah Weitzel, Brendan Holland, Radhika Carmarker, and Chad Go of the Media Bureau. Chad will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, we present to you this NPRM, which seeks comment on 3 broadcast ownership rules and 3 proposals related to diversity in broadcast ownership. The Commission is required by statute to review certain broadcast ownership rules every 4 years to determine whether they remain necessary in the public interest as a result of competition, and to repeal or modify any rule it determines to be any regulation the Commission determines to be no longer in the public interest. Now, the 3 rules subject to this quadrennial review are the local radio ownership rule, the local television ownership rule, and the dual network rule. Today's NPRM seeks comment on whether these rules are necessary in the public interest as a result of competition and thus should be retained, or whether these rules, as currently crafted, are no longer necessary. The NPRM asks if any of these rules are no longer necessary, whether they should be eliminated or modified, and if they should be modified, how they should be changed. With regard to the local radio ownership rule, today's NPRM seeks comment on a number of issues, including the relevant product market for application of the rule, market size tiers, numerical station limits, and AM/FM subcaps. The NPRM also seeks comment on whether to make permanent the interim-contour overlap methodology used to determine ownership limits in areas outside Nielsen audio metro markets, and on how to treat transactions involving markets embedded within a larger Nielsen audio metro market. With regard to the local television ownership rule, the NPRM seeks comment on various issues, including the relevant product market for application of the rule, the numerical station limit, the restriction on owning 2 top 4 stations in a market, and on the implications of multicasting satellite stations, low power stations, and the next generation transmission standard on application of the rule. With regard to the dual network rule, the NPRM seeks comment on whether a prohibition on mergers between or among the big 4 broadcast networks, which are ABC, CBS, Fox, and NBC, remains necessary to serve the public interest. With respect to all of these rules, the NPRM asks a number of questions to build a robust record for the Commission to review, but does not include any tentative conclusions. Finally, the NPRM examines 3 proposals that commenters raised in prior quadrennial proceedings that the Commission previously agreed to tee up in this proceeding and that are relevant to broadcast diversity. Specifically, the NPRM seeks comment on proposals to 1, extend cable procurement type requirements to broadcasters, 2, adopt formulas aimed at creating media ownership limits that promote diversity, and 3, to develop a model for market-based tradable diversity credits to serve as an alternative for setting ownership limits. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt this notice of proposed rulemaking and request editorial privileges to make any necessary conforming or technical edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Guo, for your presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The item before us is a balanced effort to comply with our statutory obligation, itself the result of a bipartisan compromise to review whether and/or what type of limitations should govern media ownership. I realize that some outside parties and perhaps some internally would prefer that we abdicate this responsibility, especially given the extensive litigation history and inevitable challenges that will eventually result. Others seem to cling to the vision of the media industry frozen in time in the early 1950s that has since been eviscerated by market developments and technological innovation. Despite these views, we are obligated under federal law to conduct this work. From my perspective, this entire endeavor is an exciting opportunity, and I wholeheartedly welcome the beginning of the 2018 quadrennial review, even as we sneak it just under the deadline. In fact, everyone should embrace this effort because it is a chance to reformulate our media ownership rules to reflect the current marketplace. No one, including the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, should support maintaining rules that are outdated or restrict the ability of programming outlets to reasonably compete both domestically and internationally. At its heart, this proceeding is about good governmental practices. In reviewing the text, the document should be respected for what it does. While I would have endorsed more extensive relaxation of our rules and pushed the envelope further on our ultimate objective, I appreciate that parts of the previous draft that leaned a different way have been removed. That leaves a fairly benign document that appropriately tees up the relevant questions to allow for a meaningful comment process. If I had one remaining concern, it is that the item gives credence to the belief that certain audio or video offerings can be siloed into discrete segments. We must redefine and broaden the appropriate market definition to be consistent with consumer, advertising, and business realities. Contrast this notice with the competitive market report, which we'll consider later, which has its own issues, but correctly discusses and treats the audio and video markets as each as a whole. The approach taken in the CMR, as well as other parts of the Ray Baum's Act of 2018, signal that Congress recognized the need to look holistically at the media marketplace, not in a piecemeal manner. Subsequently, I intend to pay specific attention as this process continues to how the Commission plans to reform our radio ownership rules. Despite substantial changes in the audio market, including increased competition for listeners and advertising dollars from satellite and internet offerings, radio ownership rules have not undergone any significant changes since the 1990s. Proponents of keeping the current AM/FM subcaps have proffered underwhelming arguments. The debate has appropriately shifted to determining where to draw the line on the FM side, if at all, while permitting caps to be eliminated on the AM side. Additionally, there's still work to do to reform the television-related rules, as the top four combination process is too susceptible to regulatory gamesmanship. We need to provide greater specificity or guidance, either via bright-line rules or presumptions, on which combinations are problematic and why. Depending on multiple variables, I tend to view a combination of the top station in a market and the number 4 station differently than a combination of the top 2 largest stations. Taken as a whole, this item is the start, not the end, of yet another extensive quadrennial battle. And I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Although, and I've never done this before on personal privileges, sneak it into the deadline. We have 456 hours to go before the deadline.
I'm happy you're doing it. I'm with you. I'm with you.
So, thank you. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. In this quadrennial review, we examine whether or not we should modify certain media ownership rules dating back to 1940. So as I was reading through the notice, I started to wonder, what was the FCC doing in the early 1940s? And I stumbled across a delightful book. It's titled Commissioners of the FCC, 1927 to 1994. And you would not be wrong if you judged this book by its cover. If it's not on your bookshelf already, and I could have sworn I saw it on the chairman's bookshelf once, maybe add it to your Christmas list or consider it as a stocking stuffer. The chairman of the FCC at the time was one James Lawrence Fly, who the book describes as a lanky, 6 feet, 3 inch, begoggled Texan with sandy, moth-eaten hair. I hope future historians are kinder and simply describe me as bald with a squirrel-eaten beard. The chairman, the book went on, was said to be arrogant, offensive, hot-tempered, unfair, even ruthless, and to love a bang-up fight. Under Fly's strong management and direction, the book goes on, the commission established a commanding place for itself. According to some, his leadership, quote, was so strong that Fly was not merely the chairman, he was the commission. The parallels are striking. The book even describes Fly's fellow commissioners as, quote, being at sword's point with each other, end quote. No parallel there, of course. Fly was preoccupied with what he viewed as the dangerous radio duopoly, NBC and CBS, in the specter of newspapers buying up broadcast networks. The result was a ban on long-term affiliation contracts with local stations and ownership of more than one station in a market. And along the way, Fly approved the first commercial operation of a TV station to less controversy or fanfare. Today, you hear less about radio monopolists or newspaper titans swallowing up the rest of media. Things have changed. We call news and entertainment content because it's no longer just TV or radio or magazines. Content has been liberated from its medium. So Congress got it right in the Telecom Act of 1996 when it required the commission to ask in these quadrennial reviews whether our rules should change to keep up with the times. After all, who, even in 1996, could have foreseen how online streaming would fundamentally disrupt the video and audio marketplace? For instance, as today's Communications Marketplace report notes, Netflix this year will spend more than $8 billion on content, a quarter of which is for original shows. Amazon will spend $5 billion, Hulu $3 billion. Next year, Google is expected to earn $48 billion in ad revenue, including in competition with broadcasters for local ad dollars. Spotify and Pandora are increasingly competing for the ears and attention of Americans, whether we're at home or on the go. The golden age of television, or the platinum age of content, is the direct result of choice. The gatekeepers of the past are no longer gatekeepers. Americans using a broadband connection can access any content from any device, anywhere. So I look forward to reviewing the record on how the Commission's broadcast ownership rules impact competition in the video and audio marketplace. And I want to thank my colleagues as well for agreeing to add language that seeks additional comment on the relationship between the FCC's market definition and the one used in reviews conducted by the Department of Justice. Finally, I want to thank the Media Bureau for its work on this item. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
There was a time when we waited in the morning for the news to hit the front stoop in print and on paper. Then we gathered at night to bask in the glow of a single television screen for the evening news. Gone are the days. The world has changed. Not one of us expects our news and information now to be available in such a limited way. Every one of us now looks for content at any time, in any place, and on any screen handy. This is exciting. But let's be honest, it's also challenging. The economic models that have sustained traditional news gathering have been forever changed by digitization. And while new platforms are multiplying, what is viral is not always verifiable. The questions that result are undeniably complicated. How do we advance journalism when algorithms are ascendant? How do we advance trust in real facts instead of dismissing them as fake news? How do we foster a marketplace where there is competition for ideas so that we have the information we all need to make decisions about our lives, our communities, and our country? There are no simple answers, but I think there are principles from the past that can guide us into the future. For decades, the FCC has built its media policies around the simple idea that localism, competition, and diversity matter. These values have their origin in the Communications Act. They may not be trendy, but they have stood the test of time. They continue to support journalism and jobs. I think it is essential that these principles lead this agency as it determines what comes next. Let me explain why. Localism matters. Local broadcasting remains the most trusted source of news. When the unthinkable occurs, it is also the preferred source of local emergency information. But this month, the University of North Carolina School of Media and Journalism released a study detailing the stark decline of local news in rural areas. Newspapers have collapsed, and stations are increasingly owned by national companies with limited ties to the communities they serve. What is emerging are news deserts, areas of the country where national news dominates, but local news is disappearing. Competition matters. It is axiomatic that more owners in more markets can mean more ideas. It can mean more news. The converse is also true. Too much consolidation can reduce the number of voices, jobs, and news gathering that results. And finally, diversity matters. What we see and hear over the air says so much about who we are as individuals, as communities, and as a nation. For too long, women and minorities have struggled to take the reins at media outlets nationwide. Progress in diversity is slow. But study a bit of history, and you can only come to one conclusion. Excessive consolidation is unlikely to increase diversity and more likely to make the ownership of outlets look less like the communities they serve. Once again, localism, competition, and diversity. These are the guiding principles I believe this agency should use in its quadrennial review of media ownership rules. I believe it is possible to use these guideposts to develop thoughtful reform. In some ways, I believe today's rulemaking meets this mark, including with its proposals to rethink limitations on the ownership of AM radio and the proposals to increase ownership diversity of broadcast entities. I think they deserve serious consideration. However, in other aspects, it falls short. We propose eliminating the dual network rule, clearing the way for the merger of our 4 largest broadcast networks. We propose allowing a single company to own an unlimited number of FM and AM radio stations in most communities in this country. Think about that. That would mean one company controls every radio station in the town where you live. We also fail to acknowledge that many new media sources are dependent on broadband. And in too many communities in this country, especially in rural areas, high-speed service is too hard to find. To the extent this rulemaking offers thoughtful reform, I approve. But in other respects, I dissent. It fails to honestly assess the impact of too many changes we propose on the values of localism, competition, and diversity that have informed this agency's media policies in the past, and I believe should still inform our efforts in the future.
Thank you, Commissioner. Many years ago, Congress required the FCC to conduct a review of certain media ownership rules every 4 years. Today, we kick off the 2018 quadrennial review of our local radio ownership rule, our local television ownership rule, and our dual network rule. As Congress instructed, we are seeking to determine whether these rules remain necessary in the public interest as a result of competition. Specifically, we are teeing up a broad range of questions about these rules. We want to know whether, given the current state of the media marketplace, we should retain them or modify them or eliminate them. We're keeping an open mind as to what, if anything, should change, and we hope to develop a robust record to guide us on the best path forward. Our endpoints may be unclear right now, but the end goal is not. Our rules must keep pace with the modern media marketplace. The reforms that this commission adopted last year to do just that are already having a positive impact. For example, in 2017, we eliminated the outdated newspaper radio cross-ownership rule. Thanks to that reform, the owner of Colorado's Grand Junction Daily Sentinel was able to purchase a radio station group in Grand Junction. I recently met Jay Seaton, who runs the Daily Sentinel in Grand Junction. He told me that this transaction will help him disseminate news across more formats and appeal more to advertisers, revenue from which he can pour back into the business. As he put it, ending the cross-ownership ban was 15 years overdue. And if anyone doubts the positive impact this change makes in small markets in particular, take it from Jay, and I quote, "Come out here and try running a newspaper sometime. It's a real struggle." Additionally, consistent with the FCC's commitment in the 2010 and 2014 quadrennial review order, we are seeking comment on several diversity-related proposals that were offered in the record of that proceeding. Given that this notice doesn't include any tentative conclusions, and in particular does not include a single proposal, I am disappointed that we are unable to secure a unanimous vote for it. But unfortunately, one office requested changes that did not comply with the law. Specifically, we were urged to delete any discussion of the dual network rule from this notice. But the dual network rule is one of our media ownership rules, a rule that we are required by law to review every 4 years. Whatever one's opinion of it, refusing to include it in our quadrennial review would have violated the law. And as a result, a request to remove it from the notice doesn't constitute a good faith attempt to reach consensus, but rather gives the appearance of looking for an excuse to dissent for political reasons. As always, however, I would like to thank the hardworking staff that worked on this item. From the Media Bureau, Ty Bream, Michelle Carey, Lyle Elder, Chad Guo, Brendan Holland, Tom Horan, Radhika Karmarkar, Julie Salavara, Julie Saulnier, Holly Sauer, and Sarah Weitzel, and from the Office of General Counsel, Bill Dever, Dave Consul, Jake Lewis, Bill Richardson, Bill Scher, Royce Sherlock, and one Tom Johnson. Your efforts are all much appreciated. With that, we'll move to a vote on the item. Commissioner Riley.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve in part, dissent in part.
The chair votes to approve. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks for the work. Madam Associate Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the final item on your agenda today will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau, and Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction. The item is entitled Communications Marketplace Report, the State of Mobile Wireless Competition, Status of Competition in the Market for the Delivery of Video Programming, Status of Competition in the Marketplace for Delivery of Audio Programming, Satellite Communications Services for the Communications Marketplace Report.
Thank you very much. Ms. Monteith, welcome back, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today, the Wireline Competition Bureau presents for your consideration the first biennial Communications Marketplace Report required by the Ray-Bombs Act of 2018. This document consolidates several previously separate Commission reports into a single comprehensive report assessing the state of communications in the United States. The report represents the collaborative efforts of staff from the International, Media, Wireline Competition, and Wireless Telecommunications Bureaus. I thank them for their hard work on this item. I would also like to acknowledge the valuable input we received from our colleagues in the Office of Engineering and Technology, the former Office of Strategic Planning, and the Office of General Counsel. Seated with me at the table from the Wireline Competition Bureau are Trent Harkrader, Deputy Bureau Chief, and Joseph Calashoni, Legal Advisor. And from the Bureau's Competition Policy Division, Adam Copeland, Deputy Division Chief. Joining us from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau is Patrick Sun. From the Media Bureau, Jake Ream. From the International Bureau, Gabrielle Kim. And from the Office of Economics and Analytics, Babette Boliak, the FCC's chief economist. Joseph will now present the item.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. This report, if adopted, would meet the Commission's obligation under the Ray Baums Act of 2018 to issue a report on the state of the communications marketplace in the last quarter of every even-numbered year. Going forward, this comprehensive report will replace several individual reports covering diverse areas of the communications industry that the Commission has historically published at various times. This streamlined report will provide certainty and transparency for the public, offering one-stop shopping for communications industry data. First, the report assesses the state of competition in the communications marketplace to deliver voice, video, audio, and data services. It considers all forms of competition, including the effects of intermodal competition, facilities-based competition, and emergent communication services. Second, the report assesses the state of deployment of communications capabilities, including advanced telecommunications capabilities, regardless of the technology used for such deployment. Third, the report examines barriers to entry into the communications marketplace, whether they come from laws, regulations, regulatory practices, or even marketplace practices. Fourth, the report provides an overview of the Commission's recent actions to address challenges and opportunities related to competition, deployment, and barriers to entry. Finally, the report lays out in general terms the Commission's upcoming agenda for the next 2 years and how it plans to encourage competition, reduce barriers, expand deployment, and help close the digital divide. The Bureau recommends adoption of this report and requests editorial privileges with respect to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kalashnikov, for your presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The 2018 Communications Marketplace Report is a product of Congress's directive in the 2018 Ray Baums Act to streamline the Commission's reporting requirements. My primary responsibility as a commissioner is to follow statutory authority, and I will be always loyal to the will of Congress. In addition to executing the letter of the law, the new report is a welcome first step in simplifying FCC assessment of communications competition and deployment and will provide better transparency to consumers on the state of the market. For instance, the report provides a considerable amount of data to consider future trend lines and the corresponding impact on end users. As this is the first installment of the report, my expectations were measured in view of the huge task, and I applaud staff for the work they have done in the brief time frame. In future years, I hope the reports will involve greater coordination among the various bureaus and offices involved and won't be as siloed according to technology and regulatory regime. While the report takes into account intermodal competition in certain instances, a comprehensive representation of the communications marketplace would be more helpful if it went further. For example, reports in future years should recognize increasing competition between mobile and fixed broadband providers given their substitutability, as well as disparate burdens faced by regulated entities due to competing with non-regulated entities in the same internet ecosystem. I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. The document we're voting on today is titled the Communications Marketplace Report. But it's really the Commission's first report on the race to 5G. Today's report comes out of the Ray Baums Act, enacted earlier this year. In it, Congress directed us to consolidate a variety of previously separate reports about previously distinct industries into one document. Doing so underscores how the many platforms we regulate are now locked in competition with each other. This will only increase with 5G. Consider this. Millennials have learned that through their grandparents' rabbit ears, they can get some of their favorite video content for free over the air. As the report notes, broadcast viewership has increased for the last 2 years, with broadcasters competing squarely with programming from multiple platforms, including satellite. Satellite, in turn, is building a new generation of low Earth orbit satellites that can provide broadband at speeds and latency that competes with wireless. Wireless offers voice, broadband and content and increasingly delivers it to the home in competition with cable. And cable is competing to build a fixed and mobile platform to offer broadband and video services, which will feature content of its own, that it owns, and even content it creates. That is, cable competes against broadcast, satellite, wireless, telcos, and even movie studios. This is not like any competition we've seen before. All of these previously siloed industries are competing to build fast, ubiquitous networks. All of them, from cable to satellite, are converging on 5G and other next-gen networks. And in that race to 5G, there's good news to report. After broadband investment fell during the final 2 years of the last administration, the key indicators have turned around. Broadband investment is up. Speeds have increased. Infrastructure deployments have accelerated. And prices have declined. All great signs for consumers. So I'm glad that today's report walks through these key indicators in the race to 5G. One of the most important steps we've taken to stimulate investment and competition is to streamline the rules governing the physical build-out of next-gen and 5G networks. Deploying these networks is tough work. It's hard hats and bucket trucks, harnesses and excavators. These 5G jobs are just as critical as coders and programmers. So we've taken steps to make their work easier. In March, we clarified that environmental and historic reviews designed for large 200-foot towers no longer apply to the backpack-sized small cells needed for 5G. That decision has already accelerated broadband build-out, with one carrier reporting that it's now clearing small cells for construction at 6 times the pace as it did before. And economists predict it will lead to 57,000 new small cells. In September, we established reasonable fee limits and shot clocks for localities' approval of small cells. We learned from the 20 states that had passed small cell reform bills, and we modeled our order on their work. Economists project this decision will save $2 billion in fees, stimulate $2.4 billion in new small cells, and provide next-gen coverage for 1.8 million more homes and businesses, 97% of which are in rural and suburban communities. While the September order doesn't go into effect until next month, we're already seeing positive results. In the last few weeks alone, Boston and Virginia Beach concluded agreements with carriers that include shot clocks and fee levels that mirror those in our order. So by providing clarity, our decision is helping cities and providers quickly reach agreements that further their shared goals. In short, these decisions will help 2019 be the year of 5G. For everyday Americans, this is plainly a win. It means more competition for fast, affordable broadband. It means more choices of content and services riding on top of that platform. This Race to 5G report details some of the successful policies that prepared the way for next year, and it sets out a path forward for even more improvement. So I want to thank all of the bureaus and offices that worked together on this report. It was certainly a team effort, as we see here. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Over time at the FCC, we have put together a lot of reports that are required by Congress. We gather data about the state of competition in the mobile wireless market, the satellite market, and the video market. We look at the characteristics of each of these different industry segments, the state of deployment of communications capabilities, and barriers to entry. We dig deep into facts about broadband, compiling statistics about availability and speed. In some cases, we take what we learn and benchmark it against what other countries are doing. And make no mistake, all of this activity is important. The reports that are carefully crafted in these halls become useful evidence for decisions about merger approvals, ongoing regulatory initiatives, and even new legislation. So they not only inform our work, but the work of Congress and other expert agencies like the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice. And for everyday consumers, they might in fact be the only source of public data about the state of the industry. This year, we're doing things a little bit differently. That's because Congress asked us to consolidate much of our reporting activity into a single, comprehensive report. For the first time, we are taking virtually everything we know about the communications marketplace and making it available in one place. I thank the staff at the agency for its effort in response to what is absolutely a Herculean task. And it more than does the job we were assigned to do. But I think that this new reporting model offers a bigger opportunity, and we should seize it. We should be taking steps now to ensure that this first report provides us with a solid going forward analytical basis for the communications market of tomorrow. One that provides data and facts that can be better absorbed, organized, and used to make smart laws and policy for the future. Because this is the kind of information we need if we want to have a thriving communications sector and a resilient democracy for the 21st century. I fear, however, that today's report is letting that opportunity pass us by, and let me explain why. First, in each state on the sections of this document, there is something about the analysis that comes across as old and stale. The individual reports tell us a bit about where we are, but nothing about where we are going. Take the wireless report for starters. Reading it, you would have no idea that the industry is in the middle of a transformative change to next-generation networks, technologies, and services, or that there is pending before the agency a request to combine the third and fourth largest wireless providers. And despite combining this year's wireless report with the reports on fixed broadband video and satellite, you will not find a thing about the future of convergence. In other words, we have only a backward-looking story. The FCC should be using this new format to stop thinking so narrowly, especially about our wireless markets. Going forward, wireless is so much more than the sum total of the phones in our palms, pockets, and purses. Instead, we will have connectivity coming to cars and homes, powering our smart cities, and informing data analytics in powerful ways that can make us more efficient and effective in so many sectors throughout the economy. I'm weary of reports that fail to see this future because the market is bigger and bolder than what gets reported in the here and now. Second, this report doubles down on data we know is flawed and in some cases just plain wrong. That's because we continue to rely on third parties to provide us with a lot of the information you'll find in this report. I think that we're an expert agency, and as such, we should be gathering this data ourselves, or at the very least, validating or qualifying it before we pass it along to Congress so that it will inform their decision-making. As I've suggested elsewhere, this agency needs to be a lot more creative about gathering data and needs to explore the power of crowdsourcing to inform our work. Why not start with a broad effort to engage the American public in developing a broadband and wireless map, for instance? It's time to embrace the wisdom of the crowd and not just rely on the same old industry-supported tools in our toolbox. Third, today's report fails to build on good progress this agency has made over the course of previous reports. In fact, it reverses course by cutting out important data that we previously made available. Our video reports used to discuss how broadband deployment and provider practices such as data caps and zero rating alter consumer video viewing habits. That is gone. Our wireless reports used to discuss the entire mobile wireless ecosystem, including input markets like towers and backhaul, and output markets like mobile applications and content. That too is gone. We may have a slightly shorter report, but we miss the bigger picture and the lessons to be gleaned from it. Finally, this report should not ignore some of the hard facts that are coming to light in other recently available data. Wireless market concentration, as measured by the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, is at an all-time high. According to a new study, American consumers are paying some of the highest prices for mobile data anywhere in the developed world. Almost 20 million Americans still do not have access to broadband, and according to recent reports, more than 160 million Americans are not using it. The rural divide is as pronounced as ever, with 1 in 4 rural Americans lacking access to high-speed broadband, compared to just 1 1/2% of urban Americans. Plus, the FCC's official maps, which are supposed to tell us where broadband and wireless services are and are not, we all know they have major inaccuracies in them. So I think we have real work to do, not just in updating our reporting for tomorrow's communications marketplace, but in learning from it. For that reason, I concur.
Thank you, Commissioner. Up until this year, the FCC was required by law to issue an annual Orbit Act report. Now, the Orbit Act required the Commission to report annually to Congress on its progress toward ensuring the privatization of Intelsat and Inmarsat. But this reporting obligation remained in effect for more than a decade after that privatization took place. In the parlance of Office Space, releasing this report was about as consequential as putting a new cover sheet on a TPS report. And so that is why I repeatedly supported Congress's efforts to consolidate and streamline the Commission's reporting obligations. Now, thankfully, as part of Ray Baum's Act, Congress has done just that. It eliminated obsolete and unnecessary reporting requirements like the one contained in the Orbit Act, while consolidating many of our most useful reports into the new Biennial Communications Marketplace Report, or CMR. Now, by addressing the state of the mobile, wireless, video, audio, broadband, and satellite marketplaces in one location, the CMR is a one-stop shop for interested members of Congress, policymakers, academics, and the public. It also gives us the chance to take a comprehensive view of the actions that we've taken over the past 2 years to promote competition and reduce barriers to market entry, and also to discuss our prospective plans to advance those same objectives. Now, there's a lot of interesting information contained in this report, and I encourage everyone to read it in your free time. But in case you don't, I wanted to highlight a few statistics that show the progress that we made in 2017 to increase broadband deployment and competition. For example, in 2017, the number of Americans without access to fixed terrestrial broadband service of 100 megabits per second plummeted from 78.9 million to 34.8 million, a stunning 56% drop in just 1 year. And in 2017, the number of Americans lacking access to fixed terrestrial 25 megabits per second service dropped from 24.8 million to 19.4 million. In other words, the digital divide is closing. And when it comes to competition, there's a lot of good news as well. For example, in 2017, the percentage of Americans with access to 2 or more fixed terrestrial broadband options of at least 100 megabits per second more than doubled, increasing from 26% to 54.5%. On the mobile side, too, there is positive news to report. Capital investment by wireless providers went up in 2017, reversing declines in recent years, while prices went down. Specifically, the Wireless Telephone Services Consumer Price Index fell by 11%. Now, that is more money, real money, in consumers' pockets. So as we head into 2019, we're on the right track. We aim to keep these positive trends going. We will continue to close the digital divide and bring better, faster, cheaper internet access to all Americans by continuing to eliminate barriers to infrastructure investment and broadband competition and deployment, as well as promoting innovation. Now, compiling this first-of-its-kind report and the numerous appendices attached required a huge amount of effort, and it was a true team effort. And so I therefore want to extend my sincere thanks to the many staff they were listed on the screen there from across many different bureaus, 8 by my count, different bureaus and offices, from the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the International Bureau, the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Analysis, the Office of Engineering and Technology, the Office of General Counsel, and the Media Bureau. I hope I didn't leave anyone out there, but it was pretty much anyone who works at the agency worked on this report at some point or the other. So with that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Concur.
The chair votes to approve. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to you all for the great work. Would any of my colleagues like to make any announcements at this time?
I got one or two?
Sure.
Okay, sure, I'll start. Team O'Reilly says goodbye to our fall legal intern, Kagan Despain, who's not here. He's already departed. He's actually in finals today. Kagan's actually a rare intern for us, probably one of only 5 or 6 that we've had in my time. He sought us out, actually, as a 2L at the BYU Law School and proved an excellent addition on multiple projects, including KidVid, media modernization, 911 feed aversion. I can't thank Kagan enough for all of his hard work, and I wish him well in the future, whatever it may bring. Number 2, I just recognize that happy holidays to my colleagues and anyone listening or watching. We head into a little bit of a break and won't see anyone until late January. So thanks so very much and happy holidays.
All right, we've got some coming and going of late in my office. I just want to update you. Kate Black, my savvy and smart media advisor, is now the proud mother of Charles Samuel Black, who arrived on Thanksgiving very early in the morning. And as he was overdue, we're all thankful for that. But we are missing her immensely, though we wish her well. And if you're keeping score or tabs, that is now 5 babies born in my office. J-Row 2.0 could have a basketball team in a few years. Just wait. And while Kate is out, I am really pleased that Betsy McIntyre has joined us. She is an FCC and FTC veteran. She is a graduate of Duke University and Vanderbilt University School of Law. And I first came to know her when she worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Mark Warner from Virginia. And I am absolutely thrilled she stepped in advance of this big meeting, and we are excited to work with her in the weeks ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I don't have any announcements from our office, but I did have a few announcements from around the Commission. And with the indulgence of my colleagues, I hope you will bear with me, and I think you'll understand why. We have some career employees who are leaving the Commission, in some cases after many years of service. And I want to start with the Wireline Competition Bureau with Gene Gold and R.L. Smith. You know, some might say Lennon McCartney, some may say Montana to Rice, but Gold and Smith was truly a great partnership in the Wireline Competition Bureau. Gene and R.L. are public utility specialists who together have worked an astounding 87 years in government, 77 of which were spent in what used to be called the tariff branch of the Common Carrier Bureau, and now in the pricing policy division of WCB. Now, what you might ask is the role of a public utility specialist. Well, first and foremost, public utility specialists handle tariff review and administration. Now, the number of tariff filings has declined in recent years, of course, but tariffs remain an important and complex part of the agency's work. And so public utility specialists analyze these intricate filings on a regular basis, and they have to do so with great skill and speed. And speed because tariff filings take effect by operation of law if the agency doesn't act quickly to suspend or reject them. And so Gene and RL's job is very important. And it also requires mental and physical stamina. As I understand it, before the days of electronic filing, tariffs were often thousands of pages long. God help them. As a result, public utility specialists' offices were often identifiable by the huge stacks of paper that could be found arrayed on their desks. And there's a lot less paper now, but Gene and RL's colleagues throughout the agency still regularly find their way to their offices to seek advice. Their expertise has long been relied upon for subjects that start with how to read a tariff and extend to carrier networks and universal service requirements and commercial disputes, the nitty-gritty of wireline regulation. They've acquired a vast amount of experience and institutional knowledge that greatly benefits the agency, and they've come up with creative ways of tackling some of these evolving legal requirements and technological developments. They've carried out their duties for many, many years in a most professional and cheerful way. I've always had an open door and an open mind to their colleagues, and for all their many years of service to the FCC, adorned in part with a sense of humor that is, of course, necessary when you're dealing with tariffs, their work is very much appreciated with everyone. Wherever you are, I don't know if you're here, but you exemplify the very best in public service, and I want to thank you for your work at the FCC. Next, from the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, we also have two distinguished departing colleagues. First, Karen Peltz-Strauss. Karen is a deputy chief of CGB, and she's been at the FCC since 2010, where she has helped oversee the development of multiple rules relating to the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, or CVAA, one of the most fundamental pieces of legislation in this century to ensure that people with disabilities have the same ability to communicate and get access to video programming that everyone else does. She is one of the country's premier advocates for disability rights, and that's been the case for over 3 decades. She led nationwide efforts to ensure federal safeguards to electronic communications and video programming by people with disabilities. Before joining the FCC, Karen helped author several landmark disability laws. She even wrote a book in 2006 on these topics. Previously served as legal counsel for Gallaudet's National Center for Law and Deafness and the National Association of the Deaf. She's won many, many awards from many, many groups, but to me at least, I think her credentials are best exemplified when you go to an event like the M-Enabling Summit that I had a chance to attend with her last summer, and you see in the warm smiles of the attendees the fact that Karen has spent a lifetime making sure that people have access to technology and that work has had a real and meaningful impact on millions of lives for Americans with disabilities. Karen, I don't know if you're here, but here too. Terrific. Please stand up and accept our gratitude. Next in CGB, we have Roger Goldblatt. Roger is a deputy bureau chief of the CGB, and he's been at the FCC since 2000, having survived Y2K. He's been the face of our outreach operation from his very first days, starting our FCC workshops and our town halls, our expos, roundtables, and consumer education programs. And just to give you a sense of what that means, he is quite literally the face of the FCC across the country for many Americans who will never have the ability to come here to Washington or see our work or may not want to watch us on the internet. He has traveled throughout the 50 states, meeting with consumers and consumer groups to assure them that all constituencies, but especially those underserved communities, understand the FCC's actions and rules and decisions. He was the FCC Outreach Director for the nationwide transition to digital broadcast TV, or the DTV transition, and afterward became Director of Community Outreach for our Broadband Task Force. He was also assigned to be the Outreach Director for our Connect to Health Task Force, which is the next iteration, I think, of our consumer-friendly efforts. More recently, and in addition to that, all the aforementioned, he's overseen the staffs of the CGB's Consumer Affairs and Outreach Division and its Web and Print Publishing Division, leading teams of specialists and writers and web designers to ensure that U.S. consumers are well informed about everything that we're doing. Additionally, for those of you who know him, he just exudes activity and enthusiasm. He's been a good friend to me over my many years at the Commission and a good worker here at the agency. Roger, please stand and be acknowledged for your great work. Next, from the Office of Engineering and Technology, we have Walter Johnson, or Walt, as he's more efficiently known. He's the chief of our Electromagnetic Compatibility Division. That's just a cool-sounding division. He's retiring at the end of the year after 14 years of service at the FCC. Walt's been the go-to person throughout the agency for his expertise on the internet and communications networks, as well as wireless services and spectrum management. He's perhaps best known for his leadership and as a designated federal officer for the FCC's Technological Advisory Council, which is the critical outside body that provides actionable recommendations to the FCC to help guide our policies on innovation and new technologies. Walt also did an outstanding job as the driving force behind our Measuring Broadband America program. He will be sorely missed not only by his colleagues in the OAT, but from folks throughout the Commission. And Walt, if you're here, thank you for your service to the agency. Excellent. Last but certainly not least, from the Enforcement Bureau, Mike Moffitt and Andy Bennett. I'm quite confident they're not here because they're in the field offices. So Mike is retiring with 35 years of FCC work experience. He joined the commission directly out of college in 1983 as a field agent in the Kansas City field office, or as we refer to it, the Todd Blackledge era. In 1992, he transferred to the Los Angeles field office as the senior engineer. Mike assumed the district director position in the Chicago field office in 1994 and became the regional director of the FCC's Northeast region in 2008. He received the FCC Catherine Forster Public Service Award in 2005 for dedication for commitment for providing public safety support. He supervised the FCC's response to national security events like the presidential inaugurations and presidential party nominating conventions. He also assisted in the establishment of the FCC's call center and coordinated the field's recent unauthorized broadcast pirate sweep operations. Apparently, unimpressed with the sun and fun of Southern California, Mike intends to stay in Chicago after retirement and plans to spend time, as I understand it, fishing once the rivers thaw, which should be in about June or so. Mike, thank you for your work. Last, Andy Bennett, also in the Enforcement Bureau, has a combined 25 years of FCC work experience. He started with the commission in 1974 at the Douglas, Arizona Monitoring Station, performing measurements in support of a spectrum warehousing investigation. He also worked on the CB radio enforcement effort of the late 1970s. I don't know if there's a BJ and the Bear reference somewhere in there, but I'll work on it. Eventually making his way to the Los Angeles field office. And he left the FCC for 17 years to work for both the LA County Metropolitan Transportation Authority and the Jet Propulsion Laboratories before coming back to the FCC's LA field office in 2004. He was the Employee of the Year in 2017, and upon retirement, apparently unimpressed with Chicago's architecture and deep dish pizza, Andy plans to remain in California and is modifying his interference investigation skills to become a private investigator, so LA confidential, as it were. If my colleagues don't have any other announcements, I believe we are done, and I will turn to our Madam Associate Secretary to please announce the date of the next FCC agenda meeting.
The next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission is Wednesday, January 30th, 2019.
Until then, we stand adjourned.
Great.
Welcome to the post-open meeting press conference. If everyone could please take your conversations outside and be seated. All right, I'm going to turn things over to Chairman Pai, who's going to make some opening remarks, and happy to take some questions from you all.
Thank you, Tina. Moments ago, the FCC concluded its final open meeting of 2018. And the end of the year, of course, is a time when we often reflect and take stock of how things are going, and conveniently, the Commission just approved a comprehensive report detailing the state of the communications marketplace. Now, it might take some until 2019 to go through the whole report and its appendices, but looking at the top-line findings regarding the Commission's top priority, which is closing the digital divide, you see a clear picture of significant progress. Put simply, in 2017, millions of Americans who were on the wrong side of the digital divide finally obtained access to high-speed internet and the opportunities it enables. In 2017, the number of Americans without access to fixed broadband at the 25 megabit per second standard, by that standard, the Commission's definition of broadband, that number decreased from 24.8 million to 19.4 million. We also saw real progress at higher speeds, too. 44 million Americans gained access to fixed broadband at 100 megabits per second download speeds. 66 million more Americans could get access to broadband at 250 megabit per second speeds. We also saw meaningful improvements for consumer choice and competition. Indeed, in 2017, the percentage of Americans with access to 2 or more fixed broadband options at 100 megabits per second more than doubled from 26% to over 54%. Now, while the report details undeniable progress, it also tells us we still have work to do. And that is why the Commission has been hard at work this year, building on the positive momentum of the previous year. In 2018, we removed many of the regulatory barriers to lower the cost and speed the process of building broadband networks. Early in the year, we reformed our historic preservation and environmental regulations so that small cells don't have to jump through the same regulatory hoops as a 200-foot cell tower. In the fall, we approved an order promoting 5G infrastructure, which sets a reasonable shot clock on cities to rule on small cell siting applications and sets reasonable limits on siting fees that allow localities to cover their costs. We also adopted one-touch make-ready reforms to make it easier and cheaper for broadband providers, especially competitive entrants, to access utility poles. In November, we launched the first of 2 auctions of high-band spectrum that can be used for 5G, the 28 gigahertz auction, followed by the 24 gigahertz auction, and we're on track to auction off 3 more spectrum bands next year. With these auctions, the FCC will release almost 5 gigahertz of 5G spectrum into the market. In addition to that, we also set major new horizons for unlicensed spectrum in bands like 6 gigahertz, which we hope will drive the next generation of Wi-Fi and unlicensed innovation. We continued our work to modernize our universal service programs, concluding a fixed broadband auction that allocated approximately $1.5 billion in funding using a unique reverse auction format in order to be efficient and promote deployment to over 713,000 homes and small businesses in rural America. Over the summer, speaking of rural America, we updated our rural healthcare program, increasing its annual funding cap for the first time since 1997 from $400 million to $571 million for fiscal year 2017. And going forward, the cap will be adjusted annually for inflation. The current cap is $581 million, for example, and any unused funds from prior years can now be carried forward to future years. And this will help promote telemedicine in some parts of the country where access to health care might be lacking or might not be sufficient. To promote broadband access in some of the hardest to serve rural communities, the FCC voted moments ago to improve the efficiency and impact of our rate of return program, offering additional support for small rural carriers in conjunction with increased target speeds for these subsidized deployments. It is only appropriate that I close this last press conference of the year by thanking all of the FCC staff, some of whom are in this room, for all the terrific work this year. As I mentioned last week at the Chairman's Dinner and again at the end of this meeting, they are the real foot soldiers of the public interest here at the agency. I'm very proud to call myself a coworker of theirs and are grateful for all the work they have done across the various issues that we handle to deliver what I call digital opportunity to all Americans. I look forward to working with them in 2019 to build on this progress and deliver even more value for consumers. And until that time, look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Monty Taylor, Com Daily. Why will this quadrennial review go any better in court than previous ones have? Are you taking any steps to make that happen?
Well, yes, I think if you look at the quadrennial review item, we tee up all of the rules that Congress has asked us to take a look at. We tee up a wide range of possibilities with respect to those rules, whether we should retain them as is, whether we should modify them, whether we should repeal them. And hopefully that solicits a broad range of public feedback that will enable us to make an informed decision once we go forward to the report and order stage.
Are you saying that's different than what past commissions did with this?
No, but I'm simply saying that from an administrative perspective, we've done the necessary blocking and tackling to enable us to make real progress toward a fully informed decision.
Margaret McGill with Politico. I think you suggested last week that there could be significant violations in terms of the wireless coverage data that was used for the Mobility Fund map, and you're investigating that. So I'm wondering, what does this mean for the future of the program, including a timeline for an auction?
I can't comment on the timeline. As I said in the statement, we are conducting this investigation, and until that investigation is concluded, we can't give more of a forecast in terms of timing of the overall program. But the overall program, its importance, I think, continues to be clear. When you travel around this country, as I have, to 41 states, including many, many rural communities, when you listen to the feedback that you've gotten here in Washington, I think it becomes clear that wireless service is very important for many Americans, especially when it comes to things like public safety. And so this FCC is still committed to delivering mobile services to consumers who increasingly rely on that platform.
Howard Busker, Communications Daily. Well, so you're moving forward on all these high-band auctions, but I think there's a lot of interest and concern about mid-band spectrum. And I wanted to ask you more specifically, do you see any kind of consensus or anything sort of coalescing in the C-band Or do you think that the FCC is just going to end up having to make some hard policy calls because there's not a lot of agreement?
Well, overall on midband, I'm very proud of our proactive efforts. I mean, of course, as you know, we got the 3.5 gigahertz proceeding concluded, or part of it behind us a few months ago. 6 gigahertz, which I mentioned in my opening remarks, I mean, that has been described as one of the greatest breakthroughs the FCC has made for unlicensed innovation since the original Wi-Fi bands were established. We're taking a look at other midbands. EBS is one of the things that we teed up in 2018. So I'm very excited about what midband offers in terms of 5G innovation and ultimately better mobile services for consumers. With respect to 3.7, we are still taking feedback. If I remember correctly, the comment cycle that just recently closed on part of the reply comments, and so we're still getting feedback on some of the issues that we teed up, and that's part of the reason why I was glad we opened up a notice of proposed rulemaking that was very wide-ranging and allowed people to give us meaningful input on what they think we should do going forward.
Hi, Casey Egan, S&P Global Market Intelligence. Can you tell me a little more about why the NPRM on media ownership rules doesn't make any tentative conclusions or offer any new policy proposals?
Could you repeat that question?
Sure. Can you tell me a little bit more about why the NPRM on media ownership rules doesn't make any tentative conclusions or offer any new policy proposals?
So the NPRM does not include any tentative conclusions or include any proposals. Good to know. Okay. The reason is that we wanted to tee up a wide range of options for each of the different rules. And so with respect to every rule that Congress has required us to take a look at, we wanted to say, how should we think about this? Should we retain it? Should we modify it? Should we repeal it? We didn't want to foreclose one opportunity or one avenue of opportunity for the Commission to follow, and we didn't want to rule out, we don't want to rule in any particular option. And so our hope was to have a very open proceeding where we can have an open and honest conversation about all of the rules that Congress has asked us to take a look at. And so it's for that reason that, contrary to what you might have heard, there are no proposals in this item.
John Reed, Bloomberg Law. Funding for much of the federal government will expire on December 21st unless there's congressional action. How would a government shutdown affect the FCC's operations?
We have a management team that is looking at these issues, monitoring them as they progress, and I don't have an update to give you at this time. If and when a lapse of funding approaches, then we will have more information that we will be able to share.
Hi, Chairman. Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360. I'm doing this wrong. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the FCC's new administrative law judge and whether this changes the timeline or any of the review process for Sinclair Tribune, as well as whether the agency might consider hiring more ALJs in the future to tackle some of the backlog.
Unfortunately, the only aspect of that question that I can answer is the fact that the Commission, as you might have heard, has approved that order for Jane Halpern to become the new administrative law judge. Very much appreciate Judge Sippel's service to the agency for many years. He served with distinction, and I look forward to working with Judge-designate Halpern once she's on board.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Toby from Policy Tracker. I want to ask if you're satisfied that the FCC has enough 5G spectrum in the pipeline at the moment and that it's moving fast enough on unlicensed at 37 to 37.6 gigahertz.
37, did you say?
Yeah, 37 to 37.6. The
the lower.
Yeah, the coordinated bit, or the bit that has to be coordinated.
With respect to the first part of the question, I think there's no dispute that we have a huge amount of spectrum coming into the commercial marketplace. I mean, as it described, over the next year and change, we're talking about almost 5 gigahertz of spectrum, of millimeter wave spectrum pushed into the commercial marketplace. That is a huge amount of spectrum that we hope will drive innovation and investment in the American internet economy. And I think the best ratification of the fact that we are on the right track comes when you go to these international conferences that I just had a chance to do in Dubai, and you hear from some of your counterparts around the world that they're quite interested in some of the steps that we are taking to be proactive on 5G, and they're looking to replicate some of that success in their own home country. So I'm very excited about the fact that we are leading the world in 5G, and I think the auctions that we have outlined and some of the other unlicensed innovations that we are hoping to pursue in things like 6 gigahertz will maintain that leadership well into 2019 and beyond. With respect to 37 gigahertz, your question, don't have anything specific to report at this time, but we have obviously taken a lot of feedback from some of the entities that are interested in using this spectrum, including on a shared basis, and you look forward to working with my fellow commissioners on making sure that the spectrum benefits unlicensed innovators across the internet economy.
Anyone have David? Do you have a question?
Yes, sure.
Chairman Pai, Dave Shepardson from Reuters. Two-part question. One of the things you didn't get done this year was finalizing the rules that would bar companies like ZTE and Huawei from access to U.S. telecom networks if they were deemed a security threat by the FCC. When do you think you're going to finalize that? And can you talk sort of more broadly about what your big goals for 2019 are?
With respect to the latter, I think it's going to be continuing to execute on our agenda of closing the digital divide, promoting innovation, securing public safety through the use of communications, and otherwise advancing the consumer interest through things like anti-robocall and anti-robotext efforts like that. I mean, those are sort of some of the core components of our agenda going forward. With respect to the first, what I can say is that there are serious national security issues at stake in this proceeding. We are continuing to get feedback both from stakeholders in the private sector as well as working cooperatively with our counterparts and other parts of the federal government. And don't have anything specific to report in terms of time frame, but we are actively monitoring the situation, and we look forward to working with all interested parties on it going forward.
Hi, Chairman. Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. With regard to the sixth item today about the standardization and unification of reports, could you just talk a little bit about the state of broadband data and broadband mapping, as there's been a lot of discussion recently about the coming to end of the broadband map with the FCC and the role that the FCC data of Form 477 will play in informing the NTIA's continued use of broadband data.
Sure, and just to put it in context, when I came into office in January of 2017, we had a situation in which, on the mobile side at least, carriers were simply self-reporting data using a variety of technical parameters, and we wanted to standardize that, and that is part of the reason why, in the context of Mobility Fund 2, we instituted a bespoke data collection using similar technical parameters, what are the different carriers' coverage, and then overlaying those maps to get an accurate sense of where coverage is and where it is not. Obviously, we've issued, as discussed in my colloquy with Margaret earlier, a press release announcing an investigation into whether some of the reporting of that coverage was accurate. But nonetheless, our goal here is pretty simple, to make sure that using the same technical parameters, we at the FCC have an accurate sense of what carriers are doing, or what carriers are providing in terms of mobile coverage. On the fixed side as well, we wanted to make sure that the Form 477 process was a more meaningful and more accurate snapshot on fixed broadband deployments. And that's part of the reason why we kickstarted a Form 477 proceeding, which remains ongoing, to make sure that we are getting information that is perhaps more granular or more timely. And that is a process that is very labor intensive, and I want to thank the staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau for doing tremendous work on that. But part of the reason why we instituted that proceeding early on in my tenure was to make sure that both on the mobile and on the fixed side, we have an accurate sense of what broadband coverage is like. And that will help us make more fully informed decisions going forward. Okay, thanks. Happy New Year.
This concludes the Chairman's press conference, and we'll move on to the Bureau conference led by Mark Whitfield.
Because the new data report involves basically all the bureaus, we're going to just see if there's any questions on that first. Are there questions on the CMR report? Okay, hearing none, we will move along in the order of the agenda. So let's do all the wireless items at one time, if we could. And Howard, thank you. You raised your hand. You have a question.
Yeah, I do have a question. Yeah. I figured you were about to ask that. So.
Right. There's so many items.
It would be a shame to waste all the talent we have available here to not have any questions. So.
Go ahead.
Okay, I was going to ask about the texting item, and I mean the discussion got kind of heated on that, but. What thing I'm having trouble sorting through, is this more of a theoretical thing, or I mean, have there been any problems that have cropped up so far where this sort of addresses them, in terms of the carriers not being able to do certain things?
Sure. So what the item does is provide regulatory certainty on the status of text messaging, the classification of it, and it empowers the wireless providers to, to ensure that consumers will not get unwanted messages now and in the future. And again, another obvious point is that there are 2 petitions that were filed in this docket, and the Commission is addressing those pending petitions.
But I guess my question was, though, have any problems occurred so far that this sort of addresses, or is this just sort of like more of like a Band-Aid to kind of keep problems from developing in the future?
So we don't have, again, I think what we're doing is making sure that the wireless providers have the necessary tools in place to ensure that consumers are not going to get unwanted messages. We recognize that text messaging is a valuable service for consumers. It's unique in that currently, there is a small percentage of unwanted texts, and we want to ensure that the wireless providers have all they need to ensure that consumers will not get these unwanted texts.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Anything further on wireless issues?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
It could be a very brief question. I'm just curious if anything changed on the incentive auction report and order. That changed from what was proposed back in the summer, or are you just adopting what you'd previously proposed without any changes, any meaningful change?
There were no significant substantive changes since the draft was released.
Okay, thank you.
Howard, do you had a follow-up? Okay.
So the auction. I'm confused about what the Bureau said in terms of the goals of when that'll hold this auction, but I believe that is it by the end of 2019? Is there anything? I know it's probably not in the item itself, but is there anything that you all put out that has targets as far as when that auction will take place?
Thanks for the question. I think I would just refer back to what the chairman announced earlier this year, which is that he plans to conduct an auction in the second half of 2019 for 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz.
And then also I was going to ask, there have been questions about the auction software and the ability to do multiple auctions, but will the FCC need to do any additional work on its software, the auction software, prior to, since it's 3 different bands all being auctioned at the same time?
Yeah, there will need to be software work that'll be done. This is it's an incentive auction, and there's some differences from the broadcast incentive auction. So, there will need to be software work.
And one final question is this: do you think are the technical challenges? Since you're doing this is like a different kind of auction, right? So, are the technical challenges anything close to like what you were kind of worried about coming into the TV incentive auction, or is this, relatively speaking, kind of easy relative to something like that? Or none of it's easy? I'm just curious for color.
I'd be hesitant to characterize anything as too easy or too challenging. I think there are obviously a lot of lessons learned from our work in the broadcast incentive auction that will be helpful in this regard. There are some different elements to this auction and to some things that we'll need to sort of work through. So I think we'll definitely benefit from our experience in the broadcast incentive auction, and we'll use that to address some differences here.
Thank you for indulging my auction questions.
You're welcome.
Very good. Thanks a lot. I think that's all for unless there's any more on wireless, this team can go. I think the next item on the agenda was number 2, the Connect America Fund. Are there questions on the Connect America Fund item? Okay, hearing none. We will move on to CGB robocalls. Are there questions on the CGB item? Okay, none. And the last set of items are from the Media Bureau. Any, yeah, Monty? Okay.
Hi, Monty Taylor, Com Daily. Commissioner O'Reilly described the item as being, as changes being made to change the way the item was framed or the questions in it were framed. Can you go into some detail about how the item's been altered from the draft?
I think I'll leave that to Commissioner O'Reilly to discuss, but there were the changes that were made to the draft, none of which were fundamental. No significant changes to the draft.
Can you tell me if any of the changes were suggested by Commissioner Rosenworcel? Did any of her changes make it into the final?
No.
Okay. I think that's all I got.
Anything further on this one? On these two, I guess? Okay, thank you. And now the commissioners are here for their portion of the press conference. Thank you, bureaus.
Huh? You did ask a lot of questions. You're the annoying one.
I think you said you had a squirrel-eaten beard. Yeah,
This looks good.
I'm not sure about the beauty part of that. Can we answer any questions you may have this fine day? We'll start down at this end.
I have a question. Monty Taylor, ComDaily. You said that there were shifts in the way the QR item was done at your request. Can you tell me what did you want changed about it? Like, why did you think it wasn't worded the way that you wanted initially, and what changes were made? Just roughly?
There are a couple. I think first and foremost, they're mostly stylistic and just, as I said, I would have preferred, in my statement, I said I would have preferred to have had more tentative conclusions and proposals. The decision was not to do that, so I want to make sure it was fairly balanced, and I think that's where we ended. There were a couple sentences that I thought were a little unnecessary for the item or a little worded.
Can you explain what an unnecessary sentence would be?
We're happy to, I'm sure you'll do a compare right and match them up as the document is made available. It's not a heavy rewrite in any capacity. It's more stylistic just to make sure that it's fairly balanced on the topic.
And you asked for, I think, one change, Commissioner Carr. Can you reiterate what that was? I missed it.
Yeah, it's simply actually just a couple of words ultimately when you do your compare to find O'Reilly's substantive edits. We asked a question about, we at the FCC have a market definition that we use. DOJ has a market definition that they use as well. They're both used in different ways for transactions. And the question was just to more clearly tee up for discussion, how should those two market definitions relate? How do they relate? So we can get a little bit more robust comment on that issue.
Thank you.
Howard Busker, Communications Daily. I was going to ask about C-band and do you both have concerns about mid-band spectrum? Because I mean, does seem to be a situation that it's going to be a while before some of this mid-band's coming online. 'Cause, you're getting there quickly with the high band, but the mid-band's a little ways down the road.
No, as you note, I've talked about this a number of times. I'm very interested in expediting our release of mid-band spectrum and reallocation. I fully supported, in the previous administration making the high band available, but I recognize that the mid-band became a priority a couple years ago, and I've been pushing to resolve those issues for a while. I think that there are a couple areas that we're looking at that are immediate. The 3.5 resolution of the PAL license size, I think, will help lead us to an auction. I'm hoping that will occur next year. I'm working with the chairman and the staff to try and make sure that can be held as soon as possible. You mentioned the C-band. I've been leading the effort to try and make that happen. There are a lot of difficult steps we have to go through. We obviously we're concluding our comment period. And hopefully that can end in a process that will let that spectrum be available momentarily. The third piece that I've talked about in the past is 3450 to 3550. That's a band that NTIA is examining. We originally thought that this would be more fruitful. They have since somewhat looks like to have changed their approach to the issue, and that's problematic. We're going to need is more mid-band spectrum than I've just talked about. But at least we are moving forward expeditiously on those, and I want to have those auctions as soon as we possibly can, and I've been pushing staff to make that happen.
And then on the C-band, just to follow up, the C-band to follow up.
Sure.
So the comments are all in, and I realize that you probably, but in general, are you seeing any signs that various parties are coming closer together, because it seems like it's one of those proceedings where people lay down their markers, and then you have the whole, and in the end, the FCC just has to make some hard decisions.
Well, it's too early to say. I mean, people have laid down their views and are starting to articulate their thoughts. There will be a time period to see what the sticking points are and whether they can be easily resolved or require more effort and require the commission to actually make a decision, or it can be something that everyone can coalesce around. I think it's just premature for that to make that analysis at this point.
Hi, Toby from Policy Track. I have a question for Commissioner O'Reilly. If you could expand on your WRC 19 comments. I mean, are you saying that the US is not fully prepared for it somehow, isn't pushing hard enough to identify certain bands for mobile broadband? I mean, I guess I could just...
No, I think that I was saying is that I expect and hope that the administration, collectively working with the FCC, will have just, specific proposals on 5G bands. We have had some difficulty getting to harmonization amongst ourselves, and I'd like to see that resolved as soon as possible. And therefore that we have an aggressive position to take forward in work. And we just came from CTEL, and it looked to be, from my take, and only from far away, was not able to attend, but it seemed to be not as productive as it possibly could have been, and therefore a number of the bands that we're identifying for 5G in terms of the high bands that we're heading for auction may not be something that are made available globally, and that's problematic.
I mean, do you have particular bands in mind? I mean, are you talking about 40 gigahertz? Sorry.
Well, yeah, I think they're all the bands that we've identified in millimeter wave that we've tried to move forward, and we've got different issues globally, and have had them as far back as Work 15. That the 28 difference approach to that. I think that I was much more optimistic we would get somewhere by this point, and now that there's certainly struggles to find a U.S. position is problematic in my opinion. Hopefully that will be resolved in the very near future.
Thank you.
I got a follow-up if nobody else got one.
I think we got one question over here at least.
I yield my time to Reuters.
Dave Sherman from Reuters. On the quadrennial review, do either one of you go into it favoring now repealing the dual network merger bar?
I don't have a strong, I think I said in my statement, I'm going to spend a lot of time and particularly focused on the radio side because I've talked about that a lot. So I haven't spent as much time, and I'll be interested to see where the comments take that conversation. I don't know if anyone advocating vociferously for that. We'll just have to see where the debate goes. So I don't have preconceived notions on that one. I was a little bit surprised by my colleagues suggesting that there were proposals, since the item doesn't have proposals, that I wish it did.
I'd agree. I go into it with, obviously, an open mind at the end of the day. My statement today noted some general trends that have obviously changed in the last couple of years in the industry. But as the item we voted on without proposals in it makes clear, we got to get the facts, we got to get the data. A lot of this is anecdotal, so we're going to develop a robust record, and based on that, ultimately make the decision one way or the other. And at this point, I don't know how that vote will go.
Yeah, Monty Taylor, Daily. Do either of you have any reason to believe that this quadrennial review will go differently than all of the other ones have, and why do you believe that?
Well, it depends on what your definition
In court.
is. Going differently.
Going differently in court before the Third Circuit.
Yeah, I think that the market has changed substantially in the last number of years, and I think the court will have to take that into account. The difficulty with analyzing the court's past decisions in this case is in many instances they were favorable towards the commission's rulings. They either found it for a lack of notice or a lack of timing and different pieces that we then had to come back and clean up in the recon that we did last year and the activity we'll do this year. So I'm optimistic that we can move forward on this. I've said publicly, I've given speeches, that we can't stay in this quagmire of the Third Circuit where they constantly remand the decisions back to us to make a new outcome on a decision that we've grounded in fact. We don't have a chance to challenge that behavior, and that means that those people who don't want any changes have been winning, de facto-ly for a long time period, and that's problematic. It is not supposed to be, a court is not supposed to be, use its rulings to basically keep the status quo on a market that's changed substantially since 1996.
Okay, and I'm anticipating there's probably dozens of people watching this broadcast right now, and they're all saying to themselves, I hope he asks a BDAC question. And so speaking to that audience out there who's saying, I hope he asks a BDAC question.
Might be overstating it.
Or maybe there might be somebody. No, I just wanted to ask, a pretty big thing last week. The chairman said he was going to renew BDAC's charter for 2 years and going to be delving into some additional areas. We already know a couple, but I'm just wondering if you could both offer sort of your thoughts on how the first 2 years of BDAC turned out, and what other areas would you like to see BDAC work on in the future?
It's an advisory committee. It provides recommendations. We then can digest those recommendations and decide where best to go. I think it was helpful as it relates to a number of issues they tackled on the infrastructure side, and were aggressive in trying to find compromise. It didn't exactly happen in every single place, but I think it was helpful for our purposes in deciding where best to go. In terms of the new assignment of work, I was aware of the resiliency. I may not have been, I didn't know the low income necessarily. I may have missed paying attention. I was focused on this meeting, so I wasn't aware they were going to get 2 new assignments. But I think it's an advisory committee, just like many others that we hold, and their recommendations will be of value, and we have to decide what best to do with them.
Yeah, I mean, the indication was that there were 2, and there would probably be other areas that they'd be asked to look at.
Yeah, the chairman gets to do that. He set up the organization, and he gets the opportunity to assign it work. We don't vote on that process, so I'll be interested to see where he best decides to take the advisory committee.
I think it's great when anybody ever volunteers their time and their expertise for those types of groups and committees. And as Commissioner O'Reilly says, we get to draw from that expertise. One thing I'm particularly interested in going forward when we talk about these committees more generally is taking a look at some of these resiliency issues. A couple weeks ago, as I noted, I was down in Mexico Beach, Florida, looking at some of the devastation that followed Hurricane Michael, and seeing firsthand what those telecom crews are going through on a daily basis to restore networks, some of the challenges that they hit days after storms. I think those issues are going to be key issues that this group and others can provide feedback on and inform our decisions going forward. So that's one area that I'm really interested in.
Thank you.
Anything else? Anything else we can answer? John, Don, oh, there we go.
A very quick one from me. Just following on from Commissioner Rosenworcel's comments on not moving fast for 37 to 37.6 gigahertz, the unlicensed part of the millimeter wave bands. I mean, do you agree that the FCC hasn't been moving fast enough on that, and should, is right to now expedite it, as she said in her statement?
I don't get to set the timing of items. That's the chairman. I think we've been aggressive on many different fronts in terms of making spectrum available. There are always different approaches to how things can go. I've been trying to push as hard as I can on a number of different fronts. I've been very aggressive on unlicensed, very aggressive on mid-band, and in the past I've been very helpful in pushing forward on millimeter wave. So I think we are doing a bang-up job on that, and really trying to meet the demands for the new services that will come on board, and the different things have to time at different places, and I don't have all the details to know why the chairman picks certain things.
I'll just reiterate that obviously we're pushing forward pretty aggressively. Next year, as I noted in my statement, we're going to be auctioning off more spectrum than at any other point in the Commission's history. So I'm all for continuing to keep the pedal down and pushing more spectrum out there. Good, thanks.
All right, happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you. Happy holidays to you.
All right. Anything?
I got one.
Sure.
Com Daily, Monty Taylor. Do you have any response to all the R's bringing up this dual network thing as not being legal to take out of the QR? They never named you, but I have heard that you're the one who asked for it to be taken out, and they seemed like they were implying it was you. So
Yes.
do you have any response to any of that?
I think the fraternity always implies it's me.
Yeah.
All right, causing trouble. We asked questions about a whole host of things, but the focus of this rulemaking included a focus on the dual network rule, which distinguishes it from past quadrennial reviews. So we just decided to highlight that issue in our statement. We had asked questions about it when we asked for edits with our colleagues, and that's all that's going on.
My name's Toby from Policy Tracker. You mentioned in your statement about the coordinated spectrum at 37 to 37.6 gigahertz.
In the lower portion of the band.
In the lower portion of the band, exactly. And I was wondering, when would be a reasonable time for you to have some proposals there about how it should be organized? You mentioned that there wasn't enough emphasis on that in the past.
Yeah, this is part of a broader effort to make sure that every time we think about licensed spectrum, we think about a cut for unlicensed too. In other contexts, I've called that the Wi-Fi dividend. And I think it needs to become a basic principle in this agency's spectrum rulemaking. And here, where we are clearing airwaves for exclusive use in the upper portion of 37, 47, and 39, what we've done is we have made it possible to put those airwaves to auction, and I feel like at the same time, it's incumbent on us to make efforts to build out that coordination mechanism in the lower portion of the 37 gigahertz band, so I pressed my colleagues to commit to do so in the next year. I think that's the kind of approach we need for balanced spectrum policy, which requires both licensed and unlicensed.
Howard Wilsker, Communications Daily. I wanted to ask you also about mid-band spectrum, because it does seem like that's like the big sticking point right now. Do you agree with that? That's
Absolutely.
Okay.
You're completely right. So we keep on hearing a lot about the quantity of spectrum. Let's talk about the quality. Mid-band spectrum has a terrific combination of propagation and capacity. It is the sweet spot for 5G networks, and that's why worldwide countries are rushing to auction and bring to market mid-band spectrum. China's already cleared airwaves. The UK, Spain, and Italy, South Korea have all already held auctions for mid-band spectrum to put it to market. There is no question in my mind, in that regard, the U.S. is behind. We do not currently have on the calendar any auction for mid-band spectrum. We are at risk of falling behind in what are some of the most critical airwaves for 5G service.
I know that there might be some spectrum being made available in the sharing, the GAA in 3.5, but that's...
We don't yet have that on tap for an auction. There is not a calendar that features that spectrum for auction, and we have other places to go in millimeter wave before we will get to mid-band, and I think that's a problem.
So when do you think when's the earliest that the carriers would actually be able to see more mid-band? It's going to be at least 2 or 3 years, right?
I think you're right. That's regrettable. I mean, those other countries I just mentioned to you are already bringing it to the market. They will have early scale and opportunities that we will not. It's a problem.
And to be consistent, I'll ask you a BDAC question too. Not the same question, but
I know now there's probably like less than a dozen people watching.
Yeah, our sense is we may have lost a couple of BDAC viewers because they had lunch. But I guess I was just going to ask. So now, after this is a couple years into this, I know you had some concerns about the makeup of BDAC, and what would you like to see going forward as BDAC starts a new term?
Good. There are two primary problems with BDAC. The first is that the private sector chair was indicted by the Southern District of New York. So on a going forward basis, I'm just going to ask that there are no criminals at the helm of our committees. The second problem, we had too few public sector officials sitting at that table. It was dominated by industry. The two that were there initially chose to resign because they felt that the deck was stacked against them. If we want BDAC to be a productive forum, it needs to be a balanced forum. We need to make sure that all stakeholders are represented, and that's important going forward too.
And most of the state and the municipal reports were approved with objections.
That's right.
Right. So.
That's right.
Okay. Thank you.
I just got a quick follow-up. Do you believe that this quadrennial review will go differently before the Third Circuit than the previous ones?
We do have a long history at the Third Circuit, and I think the Third Circuit has rightfully taken this agency to task for not thinking about diversity matters adequately, as is our duty under the law. So we shall see. I'm not yet at the point where I can say that I've got a crystal ball that tells us what happens with the Third Circuit this this time. I think it'll be our fourth trip back should we head there again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I know it's getting late. Just briefly, Dave Shepardson from Reuters. On the decision by the FCC to deny the FOIAs on the server logs from the net neutrality comment proceeding, what do you think the public would learn if those logs were made public that we don't already know?
It's apparent to me that this agency is hiding something. For the better part of the last year, I have pressed my colleagues to make public and investigate what went wrong in the net neutrality docket. There were 24 million filings. It is now apparent that 9.5 million of them featured stolen identities. Individuals' names and addresses were filed without their knowledge. That's a crime under federal law, and it's a crime under many state laws. We can't turn away from criminal activity. We need to figure out what's happening. There were 500,000 comments filed from Russian email addresses. What is going on? If this agency won't investigate, it will fall to investigative journalists outside these halls to figure out what happened. This is the primary channel the public has for offering its say to Washington about big issues like what their internet access looks like. It's flooded with fraud. It's an embarrassment that this agency hasn't even investigated what happened, and I think we need to do so. All right, lunch. Thank you, everyone.